terdengar dengan jelas atau masih putus-putus nih, pejuang nih? Oke, di sini ada kabar dari Kak, yang luar biasa ternyata sudah banyak banget ya pejuang Baik Berisik ya di chatbox Zoom. Dari Kak Komnas Pengendalian, oke. Dari Kak Zahra, Kak Arinah, Kak Nur Anggita, Kak Mardiah, Kak Dewi Priyana, ternyata suara saya sudah terdengar dengan jelas. Oke, mantap. Nanti ketika suara saya kurang terdengar dengan jelas, pejuang Baik Berisik boleh langsung berkabar di chatbox Zoom supaya nanti bisa dibantu untuk dievaluasi dan juga dibenarkan untuk suara saya supaya terdengar dengan jelas dan supaya lebih bisa untuk nyaman ketika membawakan kelas di membawakan event di siang hari ini ya pejuang Baik Berisik ya. Oke. Saya ucapkan kembali lagi, congratulations untuk 50 pejuang Baik Berisik yang sudah terseleksi atas kesungguhan dalam berpartisipasi berjuang untuk Palestina. Nah, untuk membuka acara pada siang hari ini, pejuang Baik Berisik, mari kita dengarkan tilawah dahulu dari Fatah Fadilah Abdul Khair. Di sini cek dulu kepada Fatah Fadilah Abdul Khair, apakah sudah ada?
Sudah ada deh.
Oke, clear suaranya ya. Oke, sip. Maka ketika dan juga kata sudah siap, maka waktu dan juga dipersilakan kepada beliau untuk
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
A'udzu billahi minasy syaithanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Subhanalladzi asra bi'abdihi laylan minal masjidil haram إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير Sadaqallahul azim. Aku berlindung kepada Allah dari godaan syaitan yang terkutuk. Dengan menyebut nama Allah yang Maha Pengasih lagi Maha Penyayang. Maha suci Allah yang telah memperjalankan hambanya Muhammad pada malam hari dari Masjidil Haram ke Masjidil Aqsa yang telah kami berkahi sekelilingnya, agar kami perlihatkan kepadanya sebagian tanda-tanda kebesaran kami. Sesungguhnya Dia Maha Pendengar lagi Maha Melihat. Maha benar Allah dengan segala firman-Nya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakumullah khair untuk kata karena sudah membacakan ya pejuang Baik Berisik tentang ayat suci Al-Quran beserta dengan arti yang tadi ya, yang kemudian semoga yang membaca dan juga kita mendengarkan bisa mendapatkan pahala di sisi Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala di pejuang Baik Berisik. Nah, selanjutnya kita masuk ke next session, yaitu akan ada sambutan dari perwakilan Smart 1 Tujuan. Kepada di sini sudah hadir di sisi kita bersama di pejuang Baik Berisik ini ada Teh Nyanyian. Kepadanya waktu dan juga layar dipersilakan. Silakan Teh Nyanyian. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Apakah suara saya jelas?
Clear, clear.
Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala asrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi washabihi ajmain. Amma ba'du. Luar biasa proses adik-adik untuk mendaftar dan kemudian lolos seleksi Baik Berisik keempat. Semoga kehadiran kita sama-sama di sini saling menguatkan satu sama yang lain ya. Selamat sudah berhasil melewati seleksi. Semoga perjalanan setahun ke depan kita bisa jalani dengan baik insya Allah. Amin ya Rabb. Kepada para para kakak-kakak panitia Pimpro Teh Zahra dan tim TPP Teh Virus dan yang lain ya, tidak bisa disebut nama semua, Teh Firda juga. Hatur nuhun, terima kasih yang banyak atas kerja keras adik-adik semuanya. Semoga Allah balas berlipat-lipat. Dan jika kita mau berkata secara jujur, kakak-kakak yang menemani adik-adik Baik Berisik sungguh secara reward dunia itu hampir nggak ada, capek kerja begitu ya, tidak ada dapat apapun begitu ya, tidak seperti orang yang bekerja dapat penghargaan dan seterusnya, tapi semoga Allah balas berlipat-lipat pengorbanan dari kakak-kakak Pimpro dan kakak-kakak panitia lainnya berlipat-lipat insyaallah, amin ya Rabbal. 2 hari ini kita dikejutkan dengan perkembangan luar biasa di Gaza. Sesuatu yang sesuatu yang tidak sebenarnya bukan dari Gaza sudah bilang kondisi warga Palestina di berbagai lokasi semakin memburuk, situasi di dalam Al-Aqsa semakin buruk, kemungkinan Gaza akan istilahnya melakukan perlawanan begitu. Nah, yang mengagetkan namanya juga serangan dadakan ya pasti tidak akan pengumuman ya, sehingga saya kaget ketika malam-malam diberi kabar oleh brother, dikirimkan video begitu ya, begini-begini dan begitu-begitu. Wah, ini berbahaya ini karena efeknya kepada Gaza akan luar biasa. Tapi saya paham alasan pemilihan sikap ini, karena alasan ini selalu menjadi landasan mengapa Gaza melakukan perlawanan. Ketika dulu Al-Aqsa diserang begitu ya, warga Muslim dilarang untuk beribadah di dalamnya, maka kemudian Gaza memutuskan untuk menyerang Zionis Israel. Pun juga beberapa minggu terakhir Muslim di Al-Quds dan juga dari tepi barat itu diusir dari Al-Aqsa, dilarang masuk ya. Bahkan kita melihat video Hanadi Halawani itu sampai jatuh dipukul oleh pasukan penjajah, dan itu bukan momen yang pertama begitu. Masih bagi para penjaga Al-Aqsa ini memang luar biasa berat. Dan pembunuhan yang dilakukan oleh Zionis Israel kepada saudara-saudara di daerah tepi barat, baru beberapa malam yang lalu orang di antara pemuda teman-teman kita yang dari tepi barat juga syahid. Lalu kemudian juga pengosongan paksa masjid Nabi Ibrahim, masjid Ibrahim di kota Al-Khalil atau Hebron. Ini semua adalah eskalasi penindasan yang dilakukan oleh Israel kepada Palestina, sehingga keputusan dari Gaza adalah untuk melakukan perlawanan. Nah, ada satu yang berita yang disampaikan oleh brother begitu ya, we can free our land just now. Begitu ya. Kita berhasil membebaskan tanah kita barusan begitu. Dan dia menunjukkan tank yang ada di luar dinding yang berhasil dihancurkan, dan teman-teman para juang pembebasan Al-Aqsa itu ada di luar dinding yang selama ini melingkari mereka dan membuat mereka tidak bisa keluar dari Gaza dengan bebas. Nah, kami berhasil menjejakkan kaki kami berhasil berdiri di atas tanah kita yang dulu dirampas oleh Zionis. Kalimat-kalimat seperti ini yang kemudian membuat konteks dari kejadian yang ada di Gaza itu perlu ditegakkan. Bahwasanya ini adalah perlawanan dari penindasan yang dilakukan oleh Zionis selama ini. Bahwasanya ini adalah proses pembebasan tanah mereka yang dirampas oleh Zionis. Ini ya adik-adik ya. Semoga Allah lindungi saudara-saudara kita, ratusan yang sudah meninggal, ribuan ya, 1000 lebih yang terluka. Semoga Allah lindungi dan Allah mudahkan proses kesembuhan mereka hendaknya. Dan bagi kita tentu kehadiran kita di Baik Berisik ini salah satunya adalah cara kita untuk terus membersihkan diri, berharap bahwasanya dengan kerja-kerja ini Allah akan berkenan untuk menguatkan kita, membersihkan diri kita dan sisa-sisa masa lalu yang bisa jadi kemudian ada banyak catatan. Semoga dengan kita terlibat di kegiatan kebaikan ini Allah berkenan untuk menghapuskan kesalahan-kesalahan kita. Still long way to go, masih panjang perjalanan kita di Baik Berisik, tahun lamanya ya, walaupun kemudian kan berarti setelah setahun kita akan selesai bekerja di sini, tapi kita sepakat bahwa ini adalah awal untuk sebuah perjalanan yang panjang dalam sebuah kebersamaan, insya Allah. Salam dari kakak-kakak yang ada di sebelah sana, saya sampaikan kepada adik-adik semua. Mereka bangga dengan kegiatan Baik Berisik. Kegiatan Baik Berisik ini adalah kegiatan yang memenangkan award ya, 2 tahun yang lalu sebagai kegiatan terbaik di dunia ya. Ada 40 negara yang waktu itu diminta untuk mengirimkan program apa saja yang dilakukan untuk remaja-remaja tentang Palestina. Maka program Baik Berisik itu termasuk 10 yang dipresentasikan, dan alhamdulillah pada finalnya Baik Berisik meraih tempat pertama. Jadi barakallahu fiik kepada Teh Zaro dan teman-teman. Semoga Allah balas dengan award ridhonya dan dengan janji pertemuan dengannya, insyaallah. Amin ya rabbal. Begitu dari Taimun. Mohon maaf lahir dan batin, dan maaf juga ini dalam perjalanan dari Jogja ke Bandung. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jelas nggak sejauh ini barusan?
Jelas deh, jelas insyaallah. Punten dia masih
Dia kalau bicara masih di mute ya. Apakah dia bicara? Tidak, dia tidak bicara seperti ini. Kalau tidak ada yang berbicara, Timun bicara lagi. Insya Allah kita dalam proses implementasi bantuan ini, bantuan medikal dan yang paling dibutuhkan ke Gaza saat ini, kita kirimkan 5.000 US dollar atau sekitar berapa tuh ya? Berarti hampir 80 juta ya, untuk tahap pertama. Semoga bisa segera sampai kepada saudara-saudara kami. Ini dia lagi start lapor, jadi saya menunjukkan aja ya. Jadi salah satu program yang sempat saya menggagas dengan kakak-kakak adik-adik di Gaza adalah menyambungkan adik-adik dengan salah satu sahabat Karena di Gaza. Jadi yang terbaik dari adik-adik nanti, ini mekanismenya dengan serahkan kepada Kak Fahiran, Sahlan, Kak Dea, Kak Untuk, Tapi insya Allah nanti yang terbaik dari adik-adik akan diberikan ya, kesempatan untuk memiliki sahabat. Kalau zaman dulu namanya sahabat pena ya. Kalau sekarang mungkin sahabat WhatsApp, sahabat laptop, atau sahabat telepon gitu. Insya Allah dengan teman yang berbahasa Inggris di Gaza. Harapannya dengan demikian Aska, Zara, ya, Dewi, Nurhalisa, Fitri, Mardia, ya, Ilmira itu akan langsung mendapatkan informasi dari sahabat-sahabat sejiwanya nanti. Ini kan akan berbeda ya, dapat berita dari Teh Dea, Teh Fairuz atau Teh Dian gitu, dibandingkan dengan dapat berita dari sahabat akrabnya yang nanti akan dipasang-pasangkan. Gitu. Akhirnya Gunawan misalnya dengan siapa, kemudian Aska dengan siapa. Nah harapannya nanti adik-adik akan memiliki akses informasi yang jauh lebih beragam dan jauh lebih cepat dibandingkan dengan misalnya menunggu informasi dari kakak-kakak di sini. Siapa yang tertarik ingin punya sahabat pena dari Gaza? Coba tangannya di-raise, tangannya diangkat. Nah, oke. Nanti insya Allah adik-adik akan diminta membuat biodata ya, biodata ya, biodata seperti biasa, kemudian hobi supaya nanti bisa disamakan dengan teman yang biasa. Terus juga nanti background pendidikan sehingga nanti semoga bisa disambungkan dengan yang backgroundnya negatif. Jadi nanti mekanismenya kita tunggu teknisnya. Bagaimana Teh Dea? Sudah berhasil masuk? Belum? Belum berhasil ya Teh Dea. Ada yang mau bertanya tentang yang terjadi 2 hari di Gaza? Boleh, mumpung Teh Dea ini belum hadir dan hari ini juga belum hadir. Ada yang bingung tidak? Kenapa sih Palestina menyerang Israel? Ada nggak? Cukup ya, kita cukup clear ya bahwasanya apa yang dilakukan oleh mereka saat ini seperti para gerilyawan, bapak-bapak pendahulu pahlawan kita ya, Jenderal Sudirman, kita melakukan perang gerilya ya, sama seperti itu. Bagaimana kemudian kita memahami ini semua dalam konteks saat ini mereka sedang dijajah dan mereka sedang berusaha untuk membebaskan tanah mereka yang terjajah. Begitu kira-kira ya. Teh Dea udah ada? Teh Fahirani?
Ada.
Masih ini?
Cek, ada suaranya.
Sudah ada? Teh Dea? Belum?
Sudah Teh.
Oke. Mangga silakan. Temun pamit undur diri ya adik-adik ya. Nanti insya Allah Temun membantu jika dibutuhkan untuk terjemahan dan lain-lain untuk hari. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oke. Terima kasih banyak jazakallahu khairan untuk Teh Maimunah yang sudah memberikan sambutan kepada kita semua bagi yang Baik Berisik ya. Oke. Nah, izin untuk konfirmasi dulu. Bagi yang Baik Berisik, apakah suara saya sudah terdengar dengan jelas atau mungkin ada putus-putus? Nanti ketika ada putus-putus biar bisa diperbaiki nih bagi yang Baik Berisik nih. Oke, dari Kak Firman, Kak Firdaus terdengar dengan jelas, Kak Asri juga. Mantap, luar biasa. Kakak tadi sudah mendapatkan suntikan ya, booster juga, boosting juga, semangat dari Teh Maimun, dan juga informasi terkait dengan ternyata Baik Berisik ini sangat luar biasa loh untuk bisa membantu para remaja untuk tetap aktif dalam perjuangan Palestina. Maka selanjutnya kita akan mendengarkan sambutan dari tim pro dan juga perkenalan tim Baik Berisik dari Teh Zahra dan tim kepadanya waktu dan juga dipersilakan.
Oke. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oke, sebelumnya suara saya jelas terdengar teman-teman semuanya?
Ya, jelas Teh.
Oke. Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim. nggak kerasa ya, BB udah buka lagi ke angkatan yang keempat ya teman-teman. Alhamdulillah tentu dengan atas izin Allah juga gitu ya. Dan alhamdulillah Allah telah memberikan kita kesempatan untuk bisa berjumpa via online dulu ya teman-teman. Insyaallah nanti kita akan agendakan juga ada kesempatan untuk bisa bertemu offline. Oke, salawat dan salam tak lupa kita curahkan kepada baginda kita ya, Nabi besar Rasulullah Muhammad SAW yang kita nantikan syafaat beliau di hari akhir nanti. Amin ya rabbal alamin. Insya Allah. Sebelumnya gimana perasaannya teman-teman ikut bisa gabung di Baik Berisik keempat ini? Ada yang mau kasih apa reaction di kolom chat boleh ya teman-teman? Karena Masya Allah nih, tidak semua yang daftar bisa lolos ya di sini. Dan tentunya barakallah untuk teman-teman semuanya yang sudah Allah pilih ya menjadi bagian dari pejuang Baik Berisik. Oke, sebelumnya tim boleh di-share, mau sedikit share screen ya. Jadi mungkin ada yang baru juga ya teman-teman di Baik Berisik, ada yang baru join di angkatan 4 ya. Ada alumni di sini? Kayaknya banyak ya alumni Baik Berisik ya, Masya Allah. Oke, siapa yang alumni di sini? Boleh raise hand? Alumni mau hitung nih, berapa nih alumni yang ada yang bisa lolos masuk ke BB4 ini? Masya Allah. Oke, mana lagi alumninya? Dulu saya alumni Baik Berisik 1, di sini juga ada Teh Pipit juga ya, kami juga dulu di Baik Berisik 1, dan sekarang kami di Allah amanahi di Baik Berisik, saya sebagai Pimpro ya, salam kenal semuanya. Mungkin teman-teman yang baru di Baik Berisik bingung ya, apa nih Baik Berisik itu apa sih gitu ya. Dan Masya Allah banyak dari teman-teman juga yang baru bukan alumni gitu ya, baru kenal Baik Berisik. Dan Masya Allah bisa bergabung bersama kita di sini. Oke, boleh di-share screen? Tadi saya sempat nyiapin PPT sedikit. Dari mungkin tim operator, boleh? Oke, sambil nungguin ya, share screen dibuka ya. Jadi Baik Berisik adalah sebuah kampanye kreatif digital yang bertujuan untuk meningkatkan kepedulian anak muda terhadap isu Palestinaan. Ya, teman-teman. Kampanye ini mengajak banyak anak muda untuk mau aktif bergerak menyebarkan kepedulian akan perjuangan pembebasan Palestina dalam bentuk informasi, karya, dan ajakan untuk menggalang donasi. Nah, ini dia teman-teman. Ahlan Sahlan bagi teman-teman semuanya ya. 50 dari 75 pendaftar. Oke, next yang kedua, boleh. Oke, dan Masya Allah teman-teman bisa bergabung di sini. Ya, kami menyebutnya adalah pasukan baru ya. Pasukan baru yang akan bergabung dan berjuang bersama membela Palestina. Oke, kita next lagi ke bawah. Oke, jadi ada sebuah informasi nih ya teman-teman. Selama 3 tahun Baik Berisik itu berjalan, nah kita sudah memiliki hampir 1000-an lebih gitu ya. 1000 lebih alumni. Nah, Baik Berisik adalah pasukan. Ya, kami menyebutnya pasukan karena memang kalau kita hitung dari jumlah alumninya gitu, satu kali buka angkatan tuh bisa sampai 1000 gitu ya. Dan 1000 prajurit yang siap membela Palestina dimanapun mereka berada melalui kekuatan sosial media. Dan teman-teman di sini ya, salah satu di antaranya. Oke, merinding gitu. Waktu saya sempat ngitung tuh, Masya Allah, ternyata banyak banget ya alumni yang sudah terlahir di Baik Berisik. Oke, kita next lagi. Oke, jadi di tahun kemarin ya, Baik Berisik 3 itu sebanyak 16.338 postingan ya, yang tercipta ya berdasarkan hashtag yang ada di Instagram ataupun Facebook dan TikTok. Dan ini sebanyak 16 ribuan ya teman-teman selama 1 tahun. Ini kita bayangkan seperti amunisi ya, senjata-senjata kita untuk meluruskan informasi-informasi yang mungkin salah gitu ya di sosial media. Dan Masya Allah, ini baru BB 3 gitu ya, belum BB 2, belum BB 1 yang sebelumnya. Nah, oke, kita next lagi. Oke, di sini tertulis bahwa Baik Berisik adalah pasukan berjumlah 1.000 prajurit ya, yang siap membela Palestina dimanapun mereka berada melalui kekuatan sosial media. Nah, kita next lagi. Oke, boleh. Nah, di sini Baik Berisik adalah pasukan besar dengan total alumni yang tadi kita sudah sebutkan bahwa ada 1.000 lebih gitu ya. Dan faktanya jumlah alumni Baik Berisik itu 3 kali lipat lebih banyak daripada pasukan perang Badar ya, pasukan Muslim di perang Badar. Kita bisa bayangkan ketika perang Badar, ada yang tahu berapa jumlah pasukan Muslim ketika perang Badar? Ada yang tahu? Boleh di chat, dikirim di chat. Wah, teman-teman ada yang tahu nih. 300. Ya, 300 sekian ya, teman-teman. Dan bayangkan kita itu di Baik Berisik ya, itu adalah kalau di total dari semua alumni itu 3 kali lipatnya. Ya, Masya Allah. Oke, kita next lagi. Kadang kita berpikir bahwa wah kita tuh sebenarnya effortnya nggak sejauh itu, nggak sejauh seperti mereka ketika perang Badar gitu. Benar, nggak sejauh itu gitu ya. Effort kita ataupun kesulitan yang kita rasakan di Baik Berisik ataupun mungkin luka ya yang kita rasakan itu nggak ada apa-apanya dengan dulu ya para sahabat ketika berperang di perang Badar. Cuman ketika Baik Berisik memiliki jumlah yang 3 kali lipat dengan pasukan yang sekeren itu gitu ya, itu sama seperti kita memiliki potensi yang besar untuk membebaskan Al-Aqsa. Ya, tapi catatannya ada syarat dan ketentuan yang berlaku nih ya teman-teman semuanya. Oke, kita next. Yang pertama kita perlu sadari ya, kita sadari bahwa sekecil apapun kita di Baik Berisik ya, kita adalah satu dari prajurit yang berada di barisan pasukan online, pasukan online Indonesia gitu ya, yang memiliki visi yang sama yaitu untuk membela Palestina. Nah, syarat ketentuannya gimana sih? Syarat ketentuan untuk menjadi bagian dari potensi besar kita sebagai pembebas Al-Aqsa itu seperti apa gitu ya. Nah, ini saya dapat inspirasi dari bukunya Teh Farah Konita ya, di halaman 89. Judul bukunya itu Hidup Sekali Lagi. Kalau teman-teman ada yang punya juga boleh dibuka ya. Nah, ada 6 ya yang saya ambil ya dari tulisan Teh Kon itu ya. Yang pertama adalah kita harus bersih hati dan niatnya. Jadi teman-teman, pertama kali kita bergabung di Baik Berisik, mari kita bersihkan hati kita sebersih-bersihnya, perbanyak istighfar gitu ya. Luruskan niatnya bahwa kita Baik Berisik, kita join Baik Berisik itu hanya untuk mengharap ridha Allah gitu ya. Untuk membantu, untuk berkontribusi dalam pembebasan Al-Aqsa gitu ya. Kemudian yang kedua, mencintai Allah dan Rasulnya di atas cinta kita kepada apapun. Ya, jadi tempatkan cinta Allah dan cinta Rasulullah di hati kita itu nomor 1. Jadi kalau misalnya teman-teman mau menjadi bagian dari perjuangan yang mulia ini, 2 poin itu yang paling utama. Ya, kemudian dilanjut dengan poin yang ketiga. Yang utama selanjutnya adalah menggantungkan semuanya kepada Allah. Ini juga bisa kita praktekkan ya, teman-teman. Kalau misalnya nanti ketika di perjalanan kita, ya, tadi kata Taimun, perjalanan kita masih panjang gitu ya, itu pasti banyak banget godaan, gitu, banyak banget kesulitan-kesulitan. Maka salah satu yang bisa kita pegang yaitu menggantungkan semuanya hanya kepada Allah. Gitu. Yang selanjutnya adalah menjaga ibadah wajib dan sunnah. Jadi pertama-tama ini sebelum kita bergerak bersama, ya melangkah bersama, kita harus kuatkan dulu ibadah kita. Mari kita lihat dulu gimana kualitas ibadah dan gimana penjagaan kita terhadap ibadah-ibadah sunnah kita. Yang kelima berupa istiqomah, ya kita harus minta kepada Allah atas keistiqomahan ya hingga berjuang hingga akhir gitu ya. Mungkin nggak cuma di batch 1, bisa seterusnya di Baik Berisik. Selanjutnya yang keenam, jauhkan dari wahan atau cinta dunia dan takut mati. Oke, kita next lagi. Oke, sebelum kita kenalan ya teman-teman, sedikit yang sebelumnya aku kasih sedikit poin ya, artinya ketika teman-teman udah bersama di Baik Berisik, kita adalah satu pasukan yang sama. Bayangkan ketika kita bisa analogikan kalau zaman dulu itu perang ya teman-teman, ada komandannya gitu ya, ada yang jaga sayap kiri, sayap kanan, ada yang maju pertama, duel gitu ya. Nah sama kayak Baik Berisik juga. Tuh, jadi tanamkan di dalam diri bahwa kita semua membawa visi misi yang besar gitu. Dengan hal itu kita harus sama-sama bersihkan niat kita ya, kemudian jaga ibadah kita. Meskipun kita tidak bisa ya menolong saudara-saudara kita seperti yang tadi saya menceritakan banyak yang meninggal gitu ya, kita tidak bisa di sana, tapi insya Allah dengan perjuangan kita di sini gitu ya, dengan jari jemari kita, dengan karya-karya kita insya Allah bisa menjadi pasukan yang tidak terlihat ya, yang selalu membela Palestina meskipun kita tidak berada di sana gitu raganya. Kayak itu yang mungkin ingin saya tekankan. Kemudian teman-teman di sini di Baik Berisik 4 ini agak berbeda dengan yang sebelumnya. Nanti saya jelaskan juga kenapa sih gitu ya. Oke, sebelum itu kita kenalan dulu. Di sini ada Pimpro yaitu saya, Siti Fatimah Zahro, kemudian ada tim monitoring, ada Teh Pipit dan Teh Nisa, kemudian ada PIC kelas gitu ya, ada Teh Ina dan Teh Vira di sini yang share screen ya, Teh Vira. Kemudian ada eksekutor dari ada Fasil ya, Teh Nurfi, dan eksekutor dari fasilitator ada Nazifah dan Wawa. Jadi teman-teman kita nanti akan pakai model kelas ya. Nanti akan ada model kelompok maksudnya, dan akan ada beberapa teteh-teteh ya yang akan memandu secara per kelompok gitu. Jadi bisa dicatat namanya, ada Teh Nurfi, ada Teh Nazifah dan Teh Wawa ya teman-teman. Selanjutnya ada tim publikasi dari Teh Safir, kemudian eksekutor ada Adila dan satu lagi Yumna. Oke, kita next lagi. Setelah perkenalan mungkin kita percepat sedikit ya karena udah mau jam 2 ya. Oke, kita lanjut sedikit. Kenapa sih Baik Berisik 4 itu berbeda gitu? Kenapa sih Teh kalau kemarin kan banyak banget yang daftar gitu ya? Kenapa sekarang cuma 50 orang gitu? Wah, menarik tuh, banyak banget yang bertanya gitu kan. Oke, salah satunya kenapa kita itu berbeda? Kita ada memilih output yang berbeda nih teman-teman. Kalau kemarin kita ada millennials dan content creator gitu ya. Nah, sekarang kita mau fokuskan ke content creator untuk menggodok ya karya-karya yang benar-benar akan terlahirkan dengan baik gitu ya. Nah, untuk millennials gimana Teh gitu ya. Jadi banyak juga yang bertanya. Kita akan arahkan ke Baik Berisik nasional. Jadi kita nggak akan habiskan 100% untuk milenial, bukan. Tapi ini adalah strategi baru untuk Baik Berisik, yang Baik Berisik keempat. Oke, selanjutnya apalagi sih Teh yang bikin beda ya? Gitu. Oke, kita next lagi ke bawah. Boleh? Oke, selanjutnya insya Allah di Baik Berisik keempat ini akan ada beberapa program baru gitu ya, yang lebih efektif nih ya teman-teman. Yang pertama ada grup pejuang, ya seperti tadi saya sampaikan, kita akan bagi teman-teman menjadi beberapa kelompok gitu. Ada 10 kelompok dan satu kelompok maksimal berisi 5-6 orang. Selanjutnya bentuk kelas interaktif, insya Allah kita nanti akan ada FGD gitu ya, akan ada juga Q&A session dan ada project. Nah, kemungkinan nanti juga akan ada nanti akan ada ini sesi khusus untuk project dan challenge gitu. Nanti akan ada challenge menarik yang bisa teman-teman ikuti bersama. Selanjutnya kita juga menyusun kurikulum materi dengan terstruktur gitu. Jadi teman-teman sekarang masuknya ke kurikulum level 1 ya. Nanti mungkin yang udah pernah ikut join Baik Berisik akan merasa ini kayaknya diulang lagi gitu ya. Cuman yakinlah teman-teman, semakin kita banyak diulang, sebuah materi akan semakin ingat, insya Allah. Selanjutnya kita juga ada penpal ya, sama seperti yang Teh Imun tadi jelaskan, ya akan ada koneksi langsung dengan sahabat pena asal Palestina, insya Allah. Oke, kita lanjut lagi, boleh ke bawah. Nah, ini teman-teman kita akan umumkan juga pembagian kelompok ya. Oke, di sini bisa mungkin sambil screenshot. Nanti kita kirim juga sih ke grup, cuman kalau yang mau langsung screenshot sambil lihat data aku kelompok berapa ya gitu ya. Boleh. Ya. Oke, ini ada kelompok 1, ada kelompok 2, kelompok 3, kelompok 4 dan kelompok 5. Kelompok 1 ada Anissa Kalila Himawan, kemudian ada Siti Fajriah Robania, ada Faruk Naufal Abdullah, Zahra Fadila, Widya Tiska Pratiwi. Oke, selanjutnya untuk kelompok yang kedua ada Asri Nur Habibah Solihah, Rita Lestari, Eva Nur Hasanah, Hamidah Fauzia, Amalia Permatasari, Ilmira Yuntapa. Oke, dan di sini ada yang kelompok 1, 2, boleh raise hand? Ada, Masya Allah. Ada lagi? Oke, banyak nih. Ya, 5, 4. Oke. Ya, jadi kita nanti akan bentuk kelasnya akan lebih interaktif ya teman-teman. Jadi nanti bisa langsung aja kalau misalnya saya nanya bisa langsung raise hand gitu ya. Oke, selanjutnya kita ada di kelompok 3 dan 4, ada Sifah Anissa, Sumayyah Al-Sahidah, kemudian Mawar Santi, Dewi Priona Amri, Zafara Fiona Kahfiani. Kemudian ada kelompok 4, ini ada yang 6 ya, ada 6 dan 5. Ada Nurlaili Safitri, Mutia Fatimah Az-Zahra, Fatimah Az-Zahra, Naila Syafika Arikoh, Sarah Mutmainnah Bidat, dan terakhir Fasya Abdillah Fattah. Oke, ada yang dari kelompok 3 dan 4? Boleh raise hand? Oke, 3 lagi, Masya Allah. Rame ya, Masya Allah. Oke. Selanjutnya kita kelompok 5 ya, ada Fatlika Anggun, ada Yumna Nirmala, Indira Setia, Nana Wahyu Nida, Fatimah Amirah Sayyifa. Oke, ada lagi yang kelompok 5? Boleh raise hand? Mau cek nih, ada nggak hadirnya nih di grand opening gitu ya? Ada, Masya Allah, Masya Allah. Oke, 3 ya. Oke, kita next lagi. Boleh, Teh Kira? Oke. Selanjutnya di kelompok 6 ya, teman-teman. Ada Wahdania Misbahulail, ada Nabilah Al-Zahra, Hilyatul Atqiyah, ada Ilmi Khairunisa, dan Hasna Adillah. Untuk kelompok 7 ada sekitar 4 orang ya, Arinah Farah Januarti, kemudian Nur Hafizah, Nur Anggita Sari, Abdullah Nasih Amin. Adakah orangnya di sini? Boleh raise hand? Oke, Masya Allah ramai nih. 4, 5. Ya, Masya Allah. Oke, kita kelompok 8 ya sekarang. Ada Harisa Megarani, ada Fauzia Okbaja, kemudian ada Nur Laila Farhana, dan Angelia Putri. Oke, kelompok 9 ada Era Jumiati M. Soleh, kemudian Mardiah Wulansari, Nurul Ilmi Musroh, dan Masda. Ada orangnya di sini? Boleh resen? Mau cek? Oke. Iya, sip. Dihafal ya teman-teman ya, ini grup, ini kelompok pejuangnya ya. Oke, kita terakhir di kelompok 10. Ada Davin Fadul Aidin, Firdan Fadian Sidik, Marsaulina Indriani, Fayuni, Asri Devi Yanti, dan Meli Amnestia. Oke, ada orangnya di sini? Hadir? Ini cukup banyak ya, 6 orang. Masya Allah, oke. Kalau nggak salah kemarin ada peserta yang dari luar negeri nih, yang domisili ya, domisili. Ada di sini nggak? Kemarin kalau nggak salah ada yang di Ankara ya, domisilinya. Ada? Oke, Insya Allah nih. Ini teman-teman ada beberapa daerah ya di sini. Insya Allah nanti teman-teman akan dikelompokkan sesuai dengan daerahnya yang di situ. Kalau nggak daerahnya berdekatan lah, biar nanti kalau kalian mau ada project yang offline gitu ya, kalian bisa bertemu. Oke, kita next lagi. Udah jam 2. Kira-kira udah ada ini pembicaranya kah? Tes. Dari Teh Dea mungkin? Belum ada?
Sudah ada. Kalau di ini sudah ada.
Oh, sudah ada. Oke, sedikit lagi, terakhir. Nah, jadi teman-teman buat terakhir ini ada aturan main. Nah, aturan mainnya kami sudah bikin video ya, teman-teman. Jadi nanti langsung aja disimak di link tersebut. Nanti akan di-share juga sama panitia ya ke grup yang utama. Oke, nanti bisa disimak sampai akhir ya. Nanti dipastikan teman kelompoknya sudah menonton gitu ya. Oke, mungkin itu dari aku. Terima kasih banyak atas partisipasinya, dan semangatnya mohon dijaga, kebersihan hati dan lain sebagainya dijaga, amal yaumiyah, dan itu dari saya. Mohon maaf lahir dan batin jika ada salah kata. Saya tutup. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakallahu khair atas pertanyaan dan juga tadi pembacaan manual kit dulunya ya, pejuang Baik Berisik. Nah, langsung saja kita akan talk show nih pejuang Baik Berisik bersama nanti hari ini akan dibersamai oleh moderator kita pada hari ini yaitu ada Teh Aska Halisa. Mungkin sebelum ke sana izin untuk membacakan sebentar tentang CV-nya Teh Aska, mungkin dari teman operator boleh untuk di share screen kan untuk dibacakan sedikit nih tentang sepak karirnya atau perjalanan karirnya dari moderator kita pada siang hari ini yaitu Teh Aska Halisa. Oke, silahkan operator bisa terkira ya, mungkin boleh untuk di share screen kan. Oke, mungkin sambil dibacakan dulu ya pejuang Baik Berisik ya tentang CV dari Teh Aska Halisa. Teh Aska Halisa ini adalah dari Universitas Pajajaran nih ya, terus dapat beberapa penghargaan dan juga beasiswa, ada di Highest School Production Test, terus ada Kepala Departemen Terbaik Award dari Scholarship, Award Business Scholarship, dan juga juara satu lomba grup akapela luar biasa. Terus ada juga beliau ini interpreter atau penerjemah di berbagai webinar, ada asisten laboratorium, asisten dosen, pengajar, dan juga pembicara yang sudah sangat banyak banget listnya nih. Bagi yang Baik Berisik nih, kalau bagi yang Baik Berisik di sini sudah banyak ya. Nah, oke, langsung saja tanpa lama-lama lagi kita sapa dulu untuk Teh Aska Halisa. Halo Teh Aska Halisa, selamat siang. Apakah sudah siap Teh?
Assalamualaikum, selamat siang Teh Dea.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Mantap banget nih. Apa namanya suaranya itu transfer energi luar biasa nih Kak Aska.
Masya
Oke,
Allah.
tanpa berlama-lama lagi, silakan waktu dan juga silakan dari Kak Aska untuk memandu talkshow pada siang hari ini. Silakan Kak Aska.
Oke, jazakallah khair Teh Dea dan teman-teman panitia ya atas kesempatannya, Masya Allah. Bener sampai sekarang ini masih gemeter gitu ya, dapat kesempatan untuk hadir ya di sebuah acara yang Insya Allah benar kita di sini sebagai orang-orang yang alhamdulillah masih Allah berikan kelebihan gitu ya ke kesadaran gitu akan perjuangan teman-teman kita di Palestina gitu. Dan alhamdulillah hari ini pun meskipun aku nggak masuk Baik Berisik, tapi alhamdulillah Allah berikan jalan gitu ya untuk bisa bergabung dalam agenda ini. Dan insya Allah nanti kita setelah ini akan berbincang ya sedikit banyak bersama narasumber kita Harry Fair ya. Dan mungkin sedikit memperkenalkan juga. Jadi Harry Fair beliau ini adalah jurnalis dan juga aktivis dari Inggris, dari London. Dan beliau ini memang sudah sejak lama gitu ya aktif membahas dan mengkampanyekan tentang Palestina. Dan terkhusus insya Allah hari ini kita akan membahas tentang salah satu film dokumenter yang telah beliau buat gitu ya, judulnya Gaza Still Alive. Nah, kalau teman-teman ada yang belum pernah nonton bisa dicek ya di internet ada, dan itu filmnya menarik banget gitu ya. Aku pribadi udah sempat menonton juga filmnya karena film Gaza Still Alive ini membedah tentang dampak agresi militer dari Israel terhadap sisi psikologis gitu ya, jadi terhadap kesehatan mental dari warga Palestina gitu yang seringkali jarang ya dibahas gitu. Biasanya kan kalau misalnya ada berita-berita Palestina gitu ya, lebih banyak membahas tentang berapa banyak jumlah korbannya gitu ya, yang sungguh mengiris hati seperti yang baru aja terjadi teman-teman. Kalau teman-teman lihat di Instagramnya Smart gitu, baru ada serangan dari yang diberikan seperti yang tadi diceritakan oleh Teimun ya saat pembukaan, dan Israel pun kembali menyerang gitu ya, memberikan serangan balik yang terakhir dari postingannya itu menyerang di rumah sakit Indonesia di Gaza. Boleh teman-teman cek di postingannya Smart ya. Dan korban jiwanya sudah ya Allah gitu ya, merinding gitu. Nah, insya Allah hari ini kita akan banyak yang ngobrol sama Harry Fair terkait banyak hal gitu ya, terutama tentang pembuatan film dokumenternya. Dah, nampaknya sekarang Harry sudah ada di ruangan ya, mungkin aku coba sapa dulu. Assalamualaikum Harry Fair.
Halo, sepertinya masih
Oh, oke. Kayak masih menghubungkan. Oke, mungkin kita tunggu dulu ya sembari.
Halo, hari got the coffee already? Bisa di gambar hari, bisa di highlight.
Sepertinya belum terdengar ya Teh sama Herli.
Hari sudah ada, sudah bisa di ya. Bisa
Mungkin teman-teman panitia yang mengontak bisa
hari sudah ini sudah kembali dari
bagaimana Teh?
Sudah kembali dari Assalamu'alaikum Hari. Bisa din, ya, biar ketahuan.
Oke.
Your camera on, Hari? Hi, thank you. I think I'll give it this time and space for you with Aska.
Oke, terima kasih Taimun. Oke, ya, bismillah. Hello Harry, can you hear my voice?
Hi, Assalamu'alaikum, how are you?
Waalaikumsalam, alhamdulillah, I'm good. Okay, first of all, maybe I would like to express my gratitude. Thank you for giving us your time today. And let me introduce myself. I'm Azka, and today I'll be maybe your partner into talking about the topic today about your documentary film, Gaza Still Alive. And maybe I would like to ask, what should I call you? Maybe is it Mr. Harry, or maybe you have another preferences?
Oh, whatever. You can call me Harry, that's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Maybe for the first question for our talk show, what motivates you to report from dangerous area such as Gaza?
Yeah. For me, it's not worth risking my life or wasting my time or energy reporting from a place that everyone else is already reporting from, because it basically means that you're producing the same stuff that everyone else is producing. I don't see that it's worth to risk my life or waste my life's time to do that. When I first went to Gaza when I was 21 to make films independently, there was next to no media coverage of Gaza. And so there was like an obvious work to do in showing people the reality, trying to humanize people, doing a sort of empathy through journalism practice. And for me, that's something which is key. And because so often the stories that are underreported like that are also the stories which are misreported as well. So they're often the ones where the humanity of the victim is underplayed, or the humanity of the victim is twisted or manipulated. And so there's a lot of work to do in the world in that respect. And it's with that clear kind of open goal of lack of supply of reporting that I felt it was worthwhile going to Gaza and making videos.
Oh, well, it's a great thing to have such kind of mindset that we don't need to do the same thing as people do. Really, thank you for your answer. And for the next question, why did you decide to make Gaza Still Alive documentary?
For me, there are a few things with Gaza Still Alive. The first is that, yes, people are starting to become more aware of mental health in their own safe, secure countries. And that's an interesting modality to explore reality, because actually you normally wouldn't really choose this for a film. In a way, that's quite a strange choice. But the reason why it's quite useful is because it allows us to see a few aspects of the situation that are not normally shown. So first of all, normally we focus on the rubble of the war in a visual sense. We don't actually focus on the rubble inside the person, which is actually the real damage. I mean, obviously there's physical damage, there's physical injury, but the real sort of moral damage, the real psychological damage, the real spiritual damage is the mental one. It's the spiritual one. And that is actually really where the war is fought. And to pretend like none of this exists, that there isn't basically a battle of wills, is to misunderstand the war, the dynamic, the power dynamic, the way the military operations work. And so for me, there were a few things here. First of all, Palestine mental health is underreported as a thing. Second of all, people start to have a sensitivity towards the issue of mental health generally in target audiences in the English language world. Third of all, this isn't something that we often look at deeply in the Palestine situation, which means there's a novelty to the story, which means it could be worth exploring. Fourth, this is actually a not just underreported element of the story, but is also a fundamental element of the story, because this is actually really how the power dynamic between the Israeli military and the Gaza factions operates. Is it a battle of wills, effectively? And there's a final sixth reason as well, which is that Israel is very aware of this power dynamic. And because it's the occupying, controlling force, it has supreme responsibility for its actions and for the well-being of those under its occupation. And so to pretend like it's not aware of these elements would be to give it a free card. And I felt it was important to put on a historical record inside the film that the Israeli army knows very well about these dynamics of the conflict. And so it's not something that we should be naive about. And we should actually really focus on these non-visible issues in a sense.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. I actually agreed with you that usually we look at the news and they normally point out the numbers of victims, like the physical effects that were happening there, but it's not quite common to talk about the mental health that were really. I've watched your documentary actually, and it's really opened my mind about a great cause. I mean, like the effect of the occupation of Israel into children in Gaza, especially. And the most sad part is when I think I watched about when there's a museum of art, I guess. It's about children's toy becoming an art, but I mean, I think it's a bit sad. Yeah, really heartbreaking to see that kind of museum even exists in this world like that.
Yeah, I think it's really important because the world stands by and watches the Palestinians be, mutilated, occupied, have their dignity taken away, and expects them just to basically sit silently and die. And often there isn't a lot Palestinians can do to assert, a sense of resistance, not military resistance, but a sense of resistance against their situation. And so a lot of the suffering is internalized and is inside and invisible and unheard. And I think what the film does is it just basically, in a way, if I can say, reminds us of the obvious, which is that Palestinians are human, and with all of the suffering that they see, witness, and experience, they have to carry that. And, when the TV cameras disappear, it all continues and goes on for people. And when the bombs stop dropping, the war still goes on inside people's heads. So I think it's about that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I really highlight the sentence you said. The war is still going on inside people's mind. Oh my God, that's really a nice point to be understand about the war. And it's still about the process of making the documentary. Did you need any permission to report inside Gaza?
So the situation with reporting Gaza with permissions is similar today as it was when I made the film. So I can just give you a little detail on that. So obviously there's two main crossings into Gaza. One is the Egyptian, one is the Israeli for pedestrian access. And the Egyptian one is more complicated because of the political situation in Egypt. So generally speaking, if you are sort of official media, you actually just use the Israeli crossing. So you just fly into Israel and take a taxi to the border. And this is really quite an interesting thing to look at in detail visually. So I'll describe that in a moment. But basically, you have permission from the Israeli press officers. You go to the border, you cross through the border, and then you go to the Palestinian side and deal with your permissions on the Palestinian side. So yes, you need permission from both sides, or if you can say both sides, to enter. The crossing between Israel and Gaza is really worth noting. Because it's actually part of the matrix of sort of control, but also dehumanization that Israel takes towards Gaza, which is it sort of treats every human that might be in Gaza as a threat, as if they're literally about to explode. So there is sort of hundreds of meters of fencing between Gaza and the Israeli terminal. And to go through this terminal, you go through hundreds of meters of caging. And basically, it's like an airport security style, but in an extreme way, to go through and out of Gaza. So this speaks to the level of control and sort of foresight that Israel has as it plans its stranglehold of control of the Palestinian territories. So that's the permissions issue. And when you go through into Gaza, you are completely under effectively the Israeli authorities' control and whim, so they can close the crossing any day of the week that they want or half of the day, and they speak to the same with their public communications. So it's worth noting this dynamic because not only, yes, do you need permission from both sides, but you clearly see in reality that there isn't a both sides in a 50-50 sense, because one side has kind of full spectrum control and has a whole sort of military terminal designed to your passage, and the other basically is just like a shed, you know, and a couple of broken chairs. So you can see clearly that, yes, it's a both sides permission, but the power dynamic seeps through even in this context. Yeah.
I see. Okay. I could imagine how, I mean, in this extreme way, like an airport boarding, but in the extreme way, do they ask, I mean, like interrogate you in some way, in a very pressured way, about like, what are you going to do in Gaza, or yeah, etc.
Yeah, there are some elements like that. So there's various elements. So first of all, that you can't take certain equipment into Gaza and leave it there. You have to basically effectively sign a contract that says that you will bring back the equipment that you take in with you. And this is a really interesting point because, of course, why wouldn't you be able to take the equipment with you? Why wouldn't you be able to leave the equipment there? Well, that's just because Israel can do that, and it's in Israel's interest to do that. So it's sort of in Israel's interest to keep the Palestinians in Gaza sort of impoverished and unable to tell their own story, even in the most elementary senses, with like not having access to the latest media equipment and stuff. And of course, they can claim, they have plausible deniability. They can claim that, well, you know, you don't leave this camera here because it could be turned into a rocket, or it could be used by Hamas for propaganda or something like this. But the essence is that they have the control, they seek to leverage the control, and it's a small example of something which should be mundane, but which Israel applies control because it can for the sake of it. So there's one thing, that you can't leave equipment there, that you sign up that you shan't do so. Yes, you have to disclose sort of what your project is or what your assignment is at an editorial level. And then, of course, you have to have sort of the permission from your editor as a journalist, which is shared with the Israeli authorities. And then that's all of the sort of official paperwork stuff. Then you have your visual ID and passes and everything. That's all the paperwork. But then there's also all of the human contact. There's all of the face-to-face contact. So obviously you have to go and collect the ID. And this is interesting because here you're dealing effectively with what is the Israeli government press office. So it's kind of, you know, it should be a bureaucratic department that normally handles basic, boring kind of paperwork and stuff. It's actually quite interesting because here you are actually having face-to-face contacts with a part of the Israeli state that is really responsible for the public relations internationally in a whole bunch of different languages and territories for the government or for the executive of the Israeli state. So it's a really interesting power dynamic. And so I've had a few interesting sort of encounters there. I shan't sort of go into massive detail, but if you imagine you're face to face with someone who is about to give you permission to go to a place that you need to report, and they're asking you about, you know, what you're reporting, and they have a moment, of course, to have a conversation with you because they effectively have, in this sort of soft power dynamic, some sort of control or sway over the situation. So it's interesting to see how that's used and what influence they take in those moments to share what you would call the Israeli perspective or the official Israeli narrative with you. That is to say, they have a few minutes with you. What are they trying to get you to think in those minutes to effectively influence your reporting? So, you know, it's not a scientific process. That is to say that if you wanted to not influence the journalist's mind, you would just give them the pass, wouldn't you? It could be given by a robot, like when you go to McDonald's and you order food on the screen. So it's not that. Instead, you're having this human relationship where there's an opportunity for people to influence what you think about a situation. So it's very different. And so, of course, it's important with permissions, with the issue of permissions. This is basically an issue of access. So it's important for journalists to maintain access to people and places that are important to them, including dangerous places, hotspots, war zones, and etc. And so these relationships shouldn't necessarily be destroyed. And so this means that there's obviously a great pressure on journalists because they are useless without access. But at the same time, access can come at a cost, which can be internally compromising to their integrity and their objectivity.
Okay. Thank you for your explanation and answer about the permission and all of those. Really unimaginable, actually, for me, like to really face that kind of situation in my life, to be facing with a real Israeli person in person like that. And still about the difficulties you face on making the documentary, but maybe could you share with us in general, like not only by the Israeli factors, but maybe also when you were in Gaza and when you were taking the video, I mean, a recording or anything else as in general? Is there any other difficulties you face when making the documentary?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of difficulties. I mean, obviously, Israel has most of the control of the situation, but when you're in Gaza, the Palestinian authorities there also have control over you, and they run a authority and a regime that is at times quite brutal towards the Palestinians there. It's quite a rough regime. And so you're not operating in some kind of, you know, paradise in the Bahamas. Yeah. It's a rough situation there. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, it's not really something to cry about because it happens anywhere in the world. I mean, it could be, you know, in Japan or Jakarta or, you know, Georgia, but, you know, if authorities see you filming, they will stop you. They will ask you for permission. It's the same everywhere. I suppose in Gaza, there are other risks because in Gaza, you have a spectrum of different Palestinian groups and political allegiances. And some of these people will be more extreme. Like obviously in Indonesia, you have sometimes a problem with extremism. So you know all about this issue. I don't have to brief you about this. But such groups or ideologies also exist in the Gaza context. I'm not talking about Hamas. I'm talking about extreme, the sort of people who want to kidnap any white person or want to kidnap and, you know, execute any foreigner and this sort of thing. So this exists as a physical risk in Gaza, and there is a history of that being a problem for people. I mean, when I first went to Gaza, there had been someone who had been kidnapped and killed in the years prior to that. So that was something to say for my risk analysis, but it felt like a sort of a risk worth taking given the situation at the time when I first went. And that dynamic has changed with regard to the power of those groups. It has changed. But again, so you have to think about these sorts of things. So it's not just the main authority there that you have to consider your relationship with. It's also effectively vigilante groups or the criminals there. So when you're in a place and there's an overwhelming dynamic, you also have to think about the smaller dynamics. So that's the case as well. And then obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, Israel has the overwhelming control of the sea, of the air, and when it wants to, really the land. And so all the time you have to consider yourself from, is there a bombardment from the sea or from the air? And obviously that's usually something which is more predictable, or something that you can kind of decide, well, I'm not going to be in this region because that's more of a threat to life. I think it's worth noting, though, something, which is it's very easy to say this as a white British person. Now, the reality, of course, is that the way the world works, sadly, is that not all lives are equal. And so if Israel had to live with a front page of a white British guy being killed, sorry, this is to say, if I was killed, to be more explicit, and it was a front page story, actually that's unlikely, but if you see my point, if it's a PR issue for Israel, that's very different than Israel having to deal with a Palestinian being killed, because quite honestly, the media won't treat this human life with any respect. Whereas, for example, in my case, because I am white British, so I'm majority sort of British in my identity, this can cause more of a problem because it's more of a news item according to the sort of racist ideology upon which newspapers run. And so Israel has to all the time calibrate how things are perceived and the effect on the psychology of not just the Palestinians, but the effect on the wider world. And this is part of the live calculation, even now when we see the situation happening this weekend in October 2023. So the point here is that I was saying that, you know, you can calibrate the risk and everything. It's easy for me to calibrate the risk as a white British journalist going to Gaza. But the brutal truth is that if I was half British and I was not white, that quite honestly, Israel's risk calculation would be different, because it could get away with probably me losing a leg or me losing my life, especially if I'm from a Muslim majority country. My risk is less because my life is less, and therefore the risk to them of taking it is less. So all of these calculations go in. And so it's interesting to note that if we can say the Israel-Palestine conflict is a conflict that rests on racism and the power application of racism, that this even affects those visiting or those witnessing temporarily. So it affects those as well. And that's very much the case. So in Gaza, the golden rule for a journalist like me is keep your phone charged, keep your mobile phone charged, make sure you've got a power bank charged. Why is this? Because if the phone has a connection, then the Israelis know where you are. And that means that they're not going to bomb within 50 meters of you or 30 meters of you. If your phone dies, then you could die. So this is the way the world works. And there you go. Yeah.
Okay. It actually left me hanging because I'm kind of speechless and shocked about the last fact you just pointed out about the phone. You need to, I actually didn't thought it was about Israel could detect that you were there and they couldn't bomb you. I mean, that's such a really
I'll tell you an anecdote briefly, because I'm rambling on here. But during the war in 2014, I was in a media building at night, and that is to say, one of the towers that houses a lot of media agencies, so media building they call it. And I was working for RT at the time, Russia Today, as a freelancer. And actually, sometimes they have a bit of a hectic or manic production schedule. So one night I was working exceptionally late in comparison to other journalists and agencies. And so I was there in one of the media towers at night. There's probably less than 20 people in the whole building. Most of them were sort of the staff that work in these media agencies, video editors and cameramen and this sort of thing. And Israelis had just attacked or threatened to attack another media tower. And so the men that were with me, they were fearful that the Israelis could next attack their media tower, the one they were in, because there's not that many people there. So if Israel wanted to take this big target out as part of a psychological warfare to destroy this media building, which is the Palestinians' ability to report what's happening, then because there's only a few people there, maybe at night, in the middle of the night, which it was, they would attack it with 5 minutes notice. So the idea of these men was, please, will you open your Twitter, what was then Twitter, and say that you're in this building to protect us from Israel thinking about attacking this building. And so it's not just the mobile phone, it's also the PR, and the presence of an international can effectively act like what we would call a human shield. So it's a very perverse situation, very twisted situation, and a very undignified situation. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That one also still give us speechless for me, because I never thought Twitter could work like that. And it's really undescribable, feeling to hear something like that are actually happening right now in this century. I mean, when everyone is really fighting for the human right and about, the UN and many other non-governmental organizations, they talk about life, the life in Africa and everywhere. And not to mention the last conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and it was really a blow up. But then when we talk about Palestine, they just suddenly silenced, and it's really
these concepts of, for me, it's always, I don't know if you have this in Indonesian, but in English we have this phrase called the international community, which is used by America and its allies, or those aligned with America and its allies. And this term is meant to mean basically sort of the respectable world, 90% of countries, and it means effectively not Iran, not Russia, not North Korea. This is effectively what it means. But actually, this is basically a concept or an aspiration. In practice, it's not a reality. And you can see this clearly with, for example, India's take on Russia-Ukraine. Actually, there is a multipolar world with multiple allegiances and calculations. And the idea that there's basically just like America, the good guy, and everyone that follows with the international community is obviously absolutely ridiculous. But the point that you talked about with NGOs and the United Nations and everything, you can think equally about international legal processes like the International Criminal Court, the ICJ. These processes, these forums are power centers which are blocked for the Palestinians. So because the Palestinians are unworthy victims, quote unquote, these roots of humanity and recognition are blocked. And so these concepts, like you said, of human rights and, the right of self-defense for Ukraine and everything, it's all completely subjective. These concepts don't exist in reality, and it's not agreed in reality that these are sort of acceptable limits. Actually, really, it sounds very cynical to say, but one has to be realistic about this. These concepts exist only as, in a way, a sort of a mythical religion, because actually when they are applied and when they are not applied is a question of power. So the Palestinians don't have the power to ensure that international law is applied to their situation. So really, these concepts are actually just a sort of a theater which is turned on and off by the powers that be, by the great powerful countries, and given all of the geopolitics of the situation. So we're often told to think, these universalist concepts or this universalist concept or forum, but actually this is an illusion. And we have to be very honest about that. And we saw that with Ukraine and Palestine, that, well, some resistance is fine, some occupation is fine, some isn't, and all of this psychodrama. And we see that very, very clearly. And so we have to, I think, watch very carefully our willingness to be naive with these concepts as journalists, because otherwise we can sort of enter a world where we're using language which actually automatically will block us from seeing the real story and the real truth, which is that these forums are not universalist. They're turned on and off subjectively according to the power of certain entities.
Okay, thank you for your answer. and it's a good how could I say it? Like a theater that you could turn on and off depending on what does the great country want it to be. And maybe to continue about the Gaza still life documentary, actually maybe is it possible if I ask you to maybe replay the trailer of your documentary so all of us could recall and again to feel the the feeling of watching that that documentary, if that's possible, of course.
Well, actually, my Zoom is not configured for audio sharing, so I'm going to be unable to play that back, but I'm going to send you in the chat the trailer address, and you should be able to just play it in your browser without issue, because unfortunately I can't, yeah.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, maybe I'll ask
without restarting my system, yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask the committee. Mungkin Tata boleh minta bantuannya untuk di share screen kan ya trailer dari Gaza Still Life-nya supaya teman-teman di sini juga bisa menonton kembali gitu ya dan nge-recall lagi nih gimana sih suasana Gaza, suasana kondisi mental health-nya gitu ya dari masyarakat Gaza. Kalau yang belum nonton nanti mungkin akan lebih terbayangkan gitu ya betapa dampak serangan Israel terhadap Palestina tuh sangat-sangat luar biasa gitu ya, mengiris hati dan miris gitu. Ketambah tadi cerita tambahan dari Harry gitu ya, yang miris tapi kadang aku sendiri pas dengar tadi nggak percaya gitu ya bahwa hal kayak gitu tuh bisa kejadian gitu ya di dunia zaman sekarang yang mana hak asasi manusia kan benar-benar dijunjung tinggi gitu ya. Sedangkan di belahan dunia yang lain gitu ya di Gaza bahkan tadi seperti yang dikatakan Harry salah satu tips gitu ya untuk survive dalam tanda kutip survive di Gaza sebagai jurnalis adalah pastikan handphone kalian nyala. Kenapa? Supaya apa? Supaya Israel tahu bahwa kamu lagi ada di daerah situ dan di situ dan Israel nggak akan ngirim bom gitu ya ke sana karena tahu gitu ada jurnalis dari luar gitu ya. Kalau konteks ini berarti ada Harry gitu ya, ada Harry di sana. Karena bisa dideteksi gitu ya dari GPS handphonenya, maka Israel nggak akan ngirim bom ke sana gitu. Itu pas dengar cerita itu bener-bener ini sih ya, miris dan sedih gitu ya, campur aduk mungkin ya, nggak pernah terbayangkan hal seperti ini akan terjadi.
Iya. Jadi kondisi Gaza itu adalah daerah yang paling ketat diawasi melalui drone atau melalui satelit. Jadi orang-orang yang di jalan saja atau yang di dalam rumah saja itu bisa dilihat oleh Israel. Makanya jika HP Abang Hari hidup, maka akan ketahuan Bang Hari ada di satu ruangan begitu ya. Jadi tidak akan dibom ruangan itu. Nah ini yang kemudian membuat penyerangan 2 hari ini mengagetkan Israel karena mendadak dan mereka kok bisa luput, tidak bisa mendeteksi pergerakan dari Gaza untuk membuka tanah mereka yang selama ini dikurung begitu kira-kira.
Oke, terima kasih tambahannya Taimun gitu ya untuk insight perihal kondisi Gaza gitu ya. Dan alhamdulillah sekarang teman-teman panitia udah berhasil buat share screen video trailernya. Mungkin boleh di full screen kan dulu ya teman-teman. Oke, kayaknya masih belum masuk teman-teman buat audionya, mungkin bisa di restart lagi share screen-nya dan di setting dulu supaya audionya masuk.
الأوضاع النفسية في غزة هي مأساوية جدا. المعاناة واسعة والحياة من أسوأ إلى أسوأ.
Trauma and grief are everywhere here, among children and among adults.
الظروف اللي عايشينها في غزة هي ظروف صادمة.
بتمنى إني أنساها لأنه الحرب هاي بتنتساش بالمرة.
الضرر الذي نتج عن الحرب مستمر.
The vast majority of Palestinian children in Gaza suffer post-traumatic stress symptoms.
وانت الحرب الجاي، وانت الموت الجاي، وانت الدماء الجاي، وانت القصف الجاي، وانت الدمار الجاي.
Itu ya teman-teman tadi trailer dokumenter dari film Gaza Still Alive gitu ya, yang diproduksi dan disusun gitu ya, dibuat oleh Harry yang sekarang sedang kita diskusi bersama. Dan maybe Harry, before we continue our talk here, I would like to explain to our audience about the talk we have discussed before, especially about the NGO and the theater stuff.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Ya, jadi teman-teman tadi mungkin aku sedikit menambahkan gitu ya, terkait diskusi yang sudah terjadi tadi gitu, perihal terutama bagian sebuah ketimpangan gitu ya, ketimpangan keadilan yang kita bisa lihat secara nyata gitu di dunia ini, di mana tadi di satu sisi gitu ya, kita bisa lihat ada UN, UNICEF atau berbagai NGO lainnya, non-governmental organization, yang mereka peduli terhadap kemanusiaan, yang mungkin kalau teman-teman pernah dengar ada SDGs lah segala macam gitu ya, tapi kita nggak melihat nilai-nilai tersebut diperjuangkan pula terhadap warga-warga Palestina gitu ya. Nah, dan tadi Harry menyebutkan kalau di British gitu ya, di Inggris itu dikenal ada namanya international, aku agak lupa tadi, tapi intinya itu adalah sebuah paham yang itu udah jadi pengetahuan umum mungkin ya, secara rahasia umum bahwasanya memang international community, ya terima kasih. Nah itu tuh udah jadi paham umum gitu ya, bahwasanya memang sejatinya kondisi-kondisi di dunia itu diatur gitu ya teman-teman oleh negara-negara powerful, yang tentu kita tahu lah ya siapa gitu. Tadi Harry juga menyebutkan contohnya ada US gitu ya, yang mana dapat diumpamakan gitu ya, sejatinya hal-hal besar yang terjadi di dunia ini seperti mungkin perang Ukraina dan Rusia kemarin gitu ya, atau mungkin konflik-konflik lain itu bisa diibaratkan sebagai sebuah teater gitu, yang bisa dinyalakan ataupun dimatikan tergantung keperluan dan kepentingan dari negara-negara adidaya tersebut gitu ya. Jadi makanya kenapa sih itu nggak berlaku di Palestina, karena itu tidak menjadi concern mereka, bahkan ya mungkin mereka punya agenda khusus untuk mematikan nilai-nilai humanity di sana, supaya orang-orang nggak melihat gitu, gimana mereka bisa mengontrol psikis warga dunia untuk tidak berempati gitu ya terhadap Palestina, dan mereka ya membolak-balikan fakta segala macam gitu. Makanya tadi diibaratkan sebagai, tadi kalau Harry bilang, it's kind of a theater that you could turn on and off gitu, seperti sebuah panggung teater yang bisa diatur sedemikian rupa, karena kan itu lakon ya, jadi mengikuti apa kata sutradara gitulah mungkin kurang lebihnya ya. Okay, maybe we could continue the talk show, the question. For the next question,
Sure.
When making the documentary, was there any pressure on you to stop the process of making Gaza Still Alive?
No, there wasn't no.
Oh, okay. It's a simple no.
It is, I'm afraid. Yeah, sorry, it's not a very sexy answer there. But there was no pressure.
Okay. So maybe it's only about struggle, but there's no pressure to stop you. Like maybe there's someone who threatened you to stop the making of the documentary.
Well, no, I mean, the thing is that the documentary was made for television, so it was produced sort of privately and then released. It's not like it was made over 3 or 4 production phases that were all public. It wasn't crowdfunded, so there was no, in a way, opportunity for people to know it was being made and try to stop me. So the only people who knew it was being made were the people directly involved with it, and the officials on both sides of the fence. So there was no sort of pressure really to be influenced. I mean, when I picked up the Israeli press pass, as I mentioned earlier, one of the people I had contact with was sort of using the opportunity in the conversation, like I mentioned, to share his perspective. And he was saying, well, his son is still affected by the war trauma from 2014. That was the last war then. And which is perfectly reasonable thing to say, was sort of sharing in a way that Israeli kids also have some war trauma symptoms. And so in a way you could kind of say that this was him testing to see whether or not I was willing to share the same story or similar story from the Israeli side. But I mean, this wasn't part of my remit. This wasn't part of my philosophy for the project. If it was to do both sides, then that would have been something different. But so this wasn't really a pressure, to be honest. I didn't feel anyway pressured by this. It'd be unfair to say so, but no, I didn't face any pressure. I think that it is an unusual topic to choose because it's non-visual, and so often people think, well, you got all this war and everything around you, why don't you show that? Well, yeah, we did show that, but we're trying to do something different. The reason why I mentioned that is because I think maybe some of the Palestinians in the production process sort of didn't fully see until the end the point of doing this. But I think by the end, everyone did understand the power of that. And I think especially during the processes of interviewing the people that we saw in the film, it actually became clear that interviewing people about their experience, giving them basically unlimited time to talk about their mental health and how they cope with the situation, was actually in itself a positive thing. Even if the film was deleted from history, the actual process of listening and being present with someone, genuinely caring and interested in what they're saying, was itself a positive thing, even though it seemed a bit of a kind of nuanced and strange thing to do in the beginning. So there wasn't any pressure. That would be really incorrect.
Okay, I see. Okay, thank you for the answer. And okay, maybe if in the making process there was no pressure, but what about after you finished the documentary? Like, did you receive any threat from Israel because of your work for Palestine?
No, I haven't. I mean, no, not in any way. I was going to say not directly. I mean, not directly, but not really in any way. I mean, direct threat is something that you see from powerless people. Powerful people don't need to directly threaten you. So I wouldn't expect to see that. But I think if we're going to talk realistically about threats and the effects on making and sharing work about Palestine, we have to look in a different place to did you receive threats, if I may say so, which is that, I just retweeted a tweet last night from someone who was remarking that the social media networks have quite a lot of born Israelis that work in them, which is absolutely what it is. This isn't a problem, but the point is that they're not just born Israelis. They're former Israeli military intelligence officers who are now working for social media giants. And I actually sort of know one of them, in the sense that a friend of mine that I went to school with actually ended up doing this. So it's just a coincidence of the universe that this friend of mine ended up working for basically the Israeli military intelligence surveillance of Gaza, and then ended up later working for social media giant. So the reason why I mention this is because the story of the Palestinian narrative, Palestinian content, censorship online, what points are acceptable, what content is acceptable, filtering of voices, censorship of voices, ghost blocking of accounts, all of this sort of thing. This is the real question to ask if we're talking about influence and power, because you can make a documentary. This is one thing, but people seeing the documentary is a completely different question. So you don't need to threaten people in 2023. I think this is the really obvious point. You don't need to threaten people. You don't even need to indirectly threaten people. You just need to ensure that the power of the person or the power of the film is reduced. And I'm not saying that that happened in my case, by the way. I'm just saying hypothetically, that's how the world really works. So yeah, you don't need to directly threaten people. If you wanted to reduce someone's power, you would just delete their stuff from social media, which does happen all the time.
Okay, an interesting answer, actually.
I'm sorry, Ari, can you tell the power used by the powerful country to diminish the influence of your documentary? Imagine how the Israel would diminish, the strength of your documentary, the narrative that you are.
I hear you. Assalamu'alaikum there. Yeah. Your connection broke a bit, but no, I don't think that Israel tried to diminish the power of the documentary. Sorry if I gave that impression. There's no evidence for that. If they did, I wouldn't know. If they did, I wouldn't know, really. So there's no evidence that I can't say that. What I'm saying is that we wouldn't know. We wouldn't need to know, because that isn't the way that it works. We're not dealing with an actor that has to physically threaten you. We're dealing with an actor that has resources that can reduce your influence without you knowing. That's the way the world works. So yeah, we're not talking about direct and known influence. We're talking about sort of known, unknown influence. Hope that.
Okay. It's I actually become more sorry. Okay. Yeah. I actually hearing about the hypothetically, how the world works, especially in terms of they don't actually threaten you, but they maybe somehow cut the access of people to know about the documentary. And I do agree that it may happen, and maybe we don't really realize that action that maybe Israel maybe actually did that to to reduce the power of documentary to spread all over the world, so people would don't know it. How am I supposed to say? Don't really get the information about the documentary. Yeah, and I agree with that.
Yeah, we have to be careful about that, because I'm not saying that the influence of the documentary is reduced by Israel, because there's no evidence of that. And actually, I have no reason to even begin to think that. I'm just really answering the question, just saying that if an effort was made, you wouldn't know about it. And that we can see clearly from the way that social media works, which is basically the main communication medium these days, that this power dynamic and the ideology and the way that this is used clearly limits and restricts the Palestinian point of view, deliberately, systematically, ideologically. And so this is the way that the power is filtered. So for example, just to give you one quick example, Palestinians in Gaza can post something on Facebook, but people won't see it. 1% of people will see it that would normally see it. This is the way that things work. So yeah, that's just to hope that clarifies.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. And maybe and talking about the people that already watched the your documentary, what was the response you received after you created this documentary? I mean, like maybe a close friend of yours, or maybe like random people in the internet, or yeah, you could share with us maybe like their response towards your documentary.
Yeah, I've had a good response to the documentary. Three main things, really. First of all, people say they watch the documentary, and well, I get a lot of feedback about the documentary, but one of the strongest feedbacks I get is from people saying that they feel hopeless after they watch the documentary. Well, there's a reason why, because that is the situation. That's what the people in the film are saying, that it's a hopeless situation. So if you feel hopeless, that means you're paying attention. So that's correct. And I'm not here to make you feel better about your life. I'm here to share what the experts have said and what people are sharing with me. So I'm not here to give you, it's not Disneyland Paris. This is the first thing. So the authenticity and the integrity of the piece of work should match the reality. It shouldn't be an entertainment in a sense. This is part of my philosophy of the project. The second thing is I get a lot of feedback from mental health professionals who are not related to Palestine, and they find the mental health modality an interesting way of exploring the situation. So I'm very, very happy about that, because there is actually, in reality, a lot of work that can be done to support Palestinian mental health professionals with the mental health community outside of Palestine. So actually, this is a very positive outcome. And it obviously helps us put all in perspective our lives to see mental health in Gaza in comparison to mental health in our safe, secure context. The other thing is that people in Gaza, or Palestinians who used to live in Gaza, who now live outside, speak to the integrity of the message of the film. They say, yes, it is like that. It's good that you raised this issue. It's good that you showed this issue, because it's something that is under discussed even in our own communities, or at least that is the message that I used to hear. It might be improved now. I'm sure it is improved now. So those are the main buckets of feedback, which I feel positive about all of those. And yeah, also the film has sort of attracted viewers who don't normally know about Palestine and don't normally know about mental health, and that's a positive thing. So I'm happy for that, because it's not an ideological film. It looks at something almost in a scientific aspect, and allows people to have a slice into the reality, looking at this situation through this particular topic without needing any background in politics, really, or background in Gaza to empathize and to begin to understand. So it's nice that it also speaks to a wider audience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Harry. And actually, also talking about the mental health, after I watched your documentary, and I really remember the narration that says in Gaza, at that time, one Gaza people that needs treatment in terms of psychology, and the one psychologist actually should treat hundreds of Gaza people that needs treatment, and it somehow it's, if I'm not wrong, it was represented as a 1 in a million. I mean, so it was a really sad condition. And does it, I mean, after this documentary, did you receive any progress of the mental health community? I mean, like psychologists, is there any improvement of the people that are concerned about that in Gaza? I mean, like the.
Yeah, I understand your question. Yeah, but just to clarify, the part of the film is the outro of the film, the epilogue, really. And we're just saying it's not actually scientific. It's meant to be rhetorical. I think it's more clear in native English, but it's sort of basically that everyone in Gaza, in an ideal world, would have their own therapist and not be in Gaza. That's the sort of message of it. And it's just saying the scale of the problem is so big that the supply of therapists will never meet the demand. And of course, it's not a realistic thing. Therapy or psychotherapy is not meant to be for majority of people. So it shows that the situation is broken. So it's more sort of subjective rhetoric than some scientific numbering. And it's in a way a silly comment because it's a war zone. Of course, people need, a better improved situation, but it's just speaking to the fact that the effect on people isn't just physical, it's not just external and social. Basically, everyone that's there is also having to tolerate this internal destabilization of their own ecology as well as that of their society and community. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about that. I don't closely track the situation there in terms of mental health anymore because I'm not physically there, but I have seen improvements easily visible in discussions about mental health, which I can't attribute to the film. I have no evidence for that. But certainly the awareness of mental health as an issue is definitely improved in the Gaza context. I can see that from discussions. And there are continuing and strengthening bonds between the Gaza mental health communities and the external mental health communities, which, if nothing, means solidarity and support, if not actual some material improvements in treatment and actual professional support. So I feel that things are better than in 2019 when the film was released in that respect, but I don't feel that we should have the impression that things are sort of much better. They're not. When we interviewed Aya, who's the not the youngest girl in the film, but the one that has metal in her body, the one that's wearing hijab. When we interviewed her for the film, the mother of Aya actually didn't know that there was a sort of basically a war trauma mental health program 5 or 10 minutes walk from their house sort of every week or whatever that was run by sort of charities and NGOs. She didn't know that it was even available, even though actually because they live in that very dangerous area, that area was targeted for specialists sort of support and intervention by the Gaza mental health communities. So it just shows that, there's the reality and there's the practice of something. So there's the theory and the reality and practice of something, which is that someone who's obviously traumatized in a family that's obviously traumatized in an area that's obviously traumatized, actually providing support for people in such a context where sort of everyone really needs support is difficult. So the scale of support available it's never going to be improved in any kind of ideal sense. It's always going to be sort of a marginal thing. But that's not something to lose hope over, because there are people in extreme mental health difficulty, which the film doesn't capture. The film captures the normative difficulty. It doesn't capture the people who are psychotic because of the situation. And so often it'll be those people or people who are really suffering, who are having much more specialist intervention. So we have to look at it in that realistic sense.
Okay, thank you, Harry, for your answer. And for the next question, and maybe this is the last question from me, because after this we will open the next discussion session with the audience. So the last question for me is, could you share with us what is your best memorable experience, either if it's good or bad, in reporting from dangerous area?
Gosh, well, you don't risk your life for no reason. You risk your life because you want to have an effect that's positive. And I think for me, knowing that reporting that I've done has connected with a lot of people, connected with people in a meaningful way, is the whole point. And so when I hear that, my live stream connected with 500,000 people, or when I get feedback from people saying, I saw you reporting on TV, and I felt it was of high quality, or thank you for showing this angle or whatever, that for me is the whole point. So there's that. But then it's also about having the actual quality sort of contact with the people that you're reporting with or sharing their story of. And for people to say, oh, this interview process felt good for me, that's something that's meaningful for me. So often we are going in and out of people's lives and sort of stealing their story, not literally, but sort of it can feel like that. It can feel quite transactional because you're turning someone's life into 2 minutes. And that is quite a brutal process. But trying to consciously sort of remedy that, I think is a powerful thing. So for me, when people say, oh, this was a good relationship, this was a good process, that's meaningful. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your honest and kind response about your member experience. I really could feel the relieving feels after you could listen that people are really pleased by your work, and it really I mean, the fact that you need to change people's stories into work is somehow feels better because people are pleased with that. Okay. Okay, maybe we could continue to our next session. So right now we will open a question from the audience, but first, Teh Maimun actually wanted to ask something. I'm gonna read the question.
Okay. Hadi, on behalf of the student of journalism department who also listening to you, is it possible to explain more in detail what is the preparation for any journalist who would like to do the reporting in a quite dangerous area such as Gaza? So, they are not going to be journalists yet in 3 or 4 years to come, but then at least they are in the first semester, and so they know what they have to face if they want to do the kind of work that you are doing. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth stating that there's no magical protocol to follow when you work in a dangerous context. It is dangerous. So it means very simply that there's a risk that you're going to get physically, psychologically injured or killed. So when you put yourself in a context that is more dangerous, you have to ask yourself, why are you doing it? Is it necessary? Am I willing to accept the risk? What could happen? What are the eventualities? In these eventualities, what would my effort be to escape these situations? So kidnap, injury, arrest, or death. We have to think about these things practically, soberly, but at the same time, physically and practically and logistically and operationally, there are considerations to minimize risk. So I'll give you just one anecdote or example, because I mean, we could spend a while talking about it, which I'm happy to do, have that much time left. In Gaza, for example, I mentioned there's a kidnap risk, or there was a kidnap risk, particularly from extremists. So one of the operational security considerations would be that you basically randomize your routine. That is to say that you go from A to B and your day-to-day activities using different routes so that your movements are less predictable. As one anecdote, but you can imagine from that your relationships with people who you trust, your digital operational security, your physical operational security are all things you have to be aware of and sensitive to. And it's worth saying that when we're talking about physical risk, the normal defense against physical risk would be actual security defense. That is to say that, are you going to actually have a physical bodyguard with you? Are you actually going to have someone who's actually trained in defense with you, which is itself a sort of defense before the fact? So in some contexts, you will have an operational team of TV production where you have a cameraman, a sound guy, a producer, a journalist, and then you may have a security person as well on the team who is they're responsible, sort of not 24/7, but their job is to worry about the security risks of the operation the entire time for the staff, and because it really is a full-time role to do it properly. So I hope that answers the question. So that would be sort of the best practice. The worst practice would be that you don't do your research about the risks, you don't have any idea about how you would mitigate the risks, and that you sort of don't even realize the risk that you've taken, and you end up paying with your life. That would be the worst case scenario. There are other considerations, like there's considerations for legally. So are you legally insured medically or professionally to operate in a war zone? If you get killed or incapacitated, you have your personal legal affairs, so like a will, for example. And also, if you're arrested or detained or kidnapped or something like that, who are the authorities who are responsible for your situation? So do you have individuals or persons who know where you are, where you should be, who can be responsible for getting in contact with authorities to try to obtain your release, or get contact with the relevant local authorities to help you? So you have these sorts of sort of diplomatic questions as well. So yeah, it's a kind of multi-spectrum of things that you have to think about. I think another sensible consideration is extraction or exfiltration. So when you go into Gaza, you know you're going in, and we asked the question earlier about how do you get permission to go in? This is obviously a valid question. The question is, how do you also get out? If you have the privilege to do so, how do you get out if you wanted to get out? So in the Gaza context, there are obviously sort of contacts you can call upon to organize an evacuation route. But in any context, if you thought about Syria or any context, you'd want to sort of think about, well, if I needed to leave for an unpredictable reason, how would I leave, and what resources would I call upon to leave? And in hostile environment training, that focuses mainly on the physical aspects. So physical awareness of risk to you within 1 meter, 10 meters, and 100 meters, or a kilometer. So it thinks about the kind of the schemas we can learn to understand and manage physical risk. How do you deal with the situation if you're actually physically kidnapped? What do you do if you are physically injured, or if your colleague is physically injured? How do you do battlefield first aid and this sort of thing? So there's a whole schema of physical considerations that one can learn that comes under hostile environment training. But I hope I've also discussed some of the other aspects, which is risk awareness and your intention, exfiltration, diplomatic and legal questions as well.
Thank you. Silakan Mas, kalau ada yang...
Okay, terima kasih Taiwan. Okay, thank you Harry for answer. And maybe we could continue to a question from the audience. Maybe I would do some explanation to our audience in here. Teman-teman, sekarang kita masuk sesi tanya jawab ya. Jadi teman-teman kalau ada yang mau bertanya boleh raise hand kalau mau langsung on mic, atau kalau mau lewat kolom chat boleh langsung diketikkan aja pertanyaannya di komen ya. Untuk tema pertama kita buka untuk 3 penanya pertama. Oke, Kak Abigail ya. Habis Kak Abigail nanti Kak Sarah ya. Oke, wah ramai nih. Oke, udah ada 3 langsung, ada 4. Oke, satu-satu ya. Oke, boleh dari Kak Abigail dulu. Oke.
Can you hear me very clear?
Suaranya agak putus.
Am I clear or?
Boleh coba di cek lagi suaranya. Oke, boleh dicat aja. Oke, sambil nunggu Abigail boleh mungkin langsung ke Teh Sarah.
Okay, thank you Kak, and hello, Assalamualaikum Brother Hari. I'm Sarah. After I heard your explanation, I feel like I embrace when I hear how Palestinian children are mentally disturbed. Well, whose life is not as stressful, often feel mentally disturbed. And actually, I had several questions, but they are answered in the previous session. I'm just wondering if there was a big change in your life after making this documentary, especially including regarding your religion. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Harry, you could answer it.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Nice to meet you and see you there. That's really difficult to answer because obviously I don't see how life would have been if I hadn't made the documentary. I think the obvious effect, though, is I actually hadn't realized the extent to which the situation is, rationally speaking, quite hopeless until I made the film. Because you hear at the end of the film, people are saying, well, look, there's no real reason to think things are going to get better anytime soon, that the hope that people have has to be something which is sort of based on faith, more based on reality. Like there's no numbers that make people think, oh, well, the thing's going to get better soon. So I think focusing on this aspect and hearing the messages from the experts made me think, wow, especially because I made the film several years after I first went to Gaza as a much younger person in a much different political context. I think it made me think, well, gosh, over the last 10 years, things have got much worse. They've got worse and worse and worse. And when you think they can't get worse, they get worse again. And I think that was a difficult thing to sort of process. But broadly speaking, I can't really say I'm sort of affected by it because I'm not affected by it. I don't live there. I don't have to live there. So if I'm affected by it, it's at a very narrow level. So it doesn't really affect me or my life, really. I might care about it, but it doesn't affect me in that way, unless I would choose for it to affect me. I mean, we can all choose for something to affect us, but that often isn't a sensible thing to do, psychologically, spiritually, or religiously, to be negatively affected by something and sort of choose to be heavily negatively affected by it. And to kind of focus on a hopeless situation isn't a sensible thing to do. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Oke, Sarah, apakah sudah terjawab atau mau di?
Sudah, Kak Aska. Terima kasih. Thank you for explanation, Brother Hari.
Oke. Makasih juga buat Sarah ya. Okay, thank you, Sarah, for the question. Okay, for the next one is from Abigail. And pertanyaannya ini agak mirip ya sama pertanyaannya Sarah tadi. Mungkin Abigail kalau mau mengganti pertanyaannya atau gimana? Boleh lewat kolom chat mungkin? Oke. Mau dilanjut ke orang berikutnya aja berarti ya. Nanti kalau misalnya kita ada waktu bisa coba nanti kita raise lagi di termin kedua ya. Oke, kalau gitu kita langsung next ke Teh Arinah ya. Boleh. Oke.
Assalamualaikum. Thanks for the opportunity. That was a great and informative explanation from Brother Harry. Thank you. And I was wondering about is there a difference in Israel's treatment between a white European journalist and perhaps Asian journalist, as far as you know? Can you explain, please?
Assalamu'alaikum. Between a who and a who, I'm sorry.
You can hear my voice?
Yeah, I heard you, but it wasn't great. You said between this journalist, and I wasn't clear what you said.
I was wondering about is there a difference in Israel's treatment between white European journalists and perhaps Asian journalists, as far as you know?
Asian, yeah. This is what I thought you said. I just wanted to make sure, yeah. White European journalists and Asian journalists. Yeah, I mean, I think I answered this earlier, which is that one of the audiences Israel cares most about is the sort of the US audience, the European audience, because of its geopolitical power. And so the populations that are sort of, or the people that are sort of associated with those populations, it's going to be more protective of or worried about than other populations. So, I mean, if I was Malaysian, I would be worried, let's say, yeah, because Malaysia is like one of the few countries that kind of like clearly does not support Israel. And, you know, if five, sounds very brutal to say, so forgive me, but if 5 Malaysian journalists were killed in Gaza, I really don't think that Israel would care that much about that, really. So because they wouldn't have to, because Israel already doesn't respect Malaysia. Like, Israel already assassinates people in Malaysia on the streets of Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia can't do anything about it at all. So, for example, so the power dynamic is as such. And so, you know, let's say, as in this example, Malaysia can't do anything. And sort of wouldn't be able to do anything. Whereas if it was sort of French, German, English, American, or Canadian, you'd feel that there's a very different relationship there, especially in the American case. So I hope that answers your question.
Oke, gimana Teh Arin? Mungkin boleh. Kalau misalnya sudah terjawab atau kalau mau dilanjutkan boleh ditanyakan lagi.
Thank you. It's clear enough. Thank you for your answer, Brother Harry.
Okay. Thank you, Arina. Okay, we move to another question from Kurata. Teh Kurata boleh sekarang menyampaikan pertanyaannya.
Hello, my name is Kurata Yuni Maratutantiza. I'm a journalism student. So my question is, why the Israeli people go after Gaza so much? What makes Gaza so special? And in this modern era, how can colonization still happen? Does United Nations doesn't do anything at all to prevent the colonization in Palestine? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions there. That's really difficult to answer. Why does Israel go after Gaza so much? I suppose let's rephrase the question. Why is there so much Israeli violence against Gaza? Well, that's a good question. It forces us to ask a lot of questions. So Israel withdrew from Gaza. Israel took out settlers who are living in Gaza. It withdrew most of its soldiers from Gaza. So it chose to be outside of Gaza, looking in, controlling the sea, the land, and the air. And some analysts of the situation say that this was a sort of, in a way, a act that deliberately created a conflict that Israel would manage in this way. So over the last period since Israel withdrew, Israel, broadly speaking, has imprisoned the population in Gaza, controlled the land, sea, and air, and very infrequently entered Gaza with its troops. Most of the military sort of power against Gaza is remote. Whereas in the West Bank, which is another part of the Palestinian territory, it's the opposite. You have Israel going in all of the time with soldiers, and you have very little use of air military power, and certainly no sea military power. So it's the opposite. So you have to ask yourself, well, that's really curious. And some analysts say that this is really, or that there are sort of, if I can say, tertiary reasons for this, conveniences for this. So number one is you have an enemy that you allow to build up in a controlled way. And so the part of the logic for this is that certain parts of the Israeli political system require that kind of enemy to exist for their domestic political power to be strong. So that's to say that we don't necessarily want to destroy our enemy. We may want our enemy to exist in a particular way and to be contained and controlled in a particular way. So there's a theory that relates to this, which is that Israel allowed Hamas, which is the enemy of Israel in Gaza, to become powerful, and then allowed it to gain control of Gaza, but have it within the parameters that it has done for such a long time, until yesterday, that is, of course. So there's one theory about that. And there are related theories as well, which say that, well, it's very convenient for Israel to have a controlled environment, which is what Gaza is, almost like a laboratory, to test weapons on. So all of the latest weapons are tested in Gaza. All of the latest military intelligence methods are meant to be tested in Gaza. So there's a theory also that the close relationship between the Israeli military companies, Israeli intelligence and politics and society interlace. And therefore, it's convenient to have part of the ongoing conflict played out in such a way that the weapons and the sort of capabilities that Israel can be tested and used close to home in this way. So that's another theory that some analysts will give you. But the short answer about why there is so much fighting in Gaza is that I'm not sure that's actually correct. We have the image, Israel attacks Gaza so much. Well, it depends what you mean. I mean, if you look at other parts of Palestine, the attacks are much more frequent. You could say that they're worse for people's mental health. I mean, if you think about Jerusalem or the West Bank, there are Israeli soldiers there often all the time or every day. They're going into your home at night. They can terrorize your children anytime, randomly, on their way to school. In Gaza, it's not necessarily like that. There are different levels of torment and torture and terror, but in a way, the Gaza experience is very different. So I'm just saying that because we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean? What do we mean by, the situation is so bad? Because there are different kinds of bad. And it's easy to think about Gaza because we get the dramatic pictures from Gaza. But it's also to remember that there are other parts of Palestine that are affected in arguably a very terrible way as well. So I think it's really important to say that. I think sorry to finally say, part of your question is, why is Gaza special? So to answer that question, I think some people feel or think Gaza is special, including some people living in Gaza. And that's not something really necessarily you can speak objectively about. But if people are going through a terrible situation and they believe that there's a reason or a cause or a meaning behind it, of course, they're going to be telling themselves there's something special here that we're having to endure and be steadfast in the face of. So it's not a surprise that people are going to assert that something special is happening. And so I think you can see, as part of the coping mechanism, people saying this is a special case. It is a special case. It is a special place. People are being expected to survive the unexpectable, and the insane situation. So I think that's part of the reality, is that it's a terrible situation because it's a terrible situation, and it's a special place because horrific things are happening to it. So I hope that gives you a balanced answer of those different aspects.
Oke, Kurota, mungkin mau menanggapi lagi atau sudah cukup?
Okay. Like you said before, in West Bank, I have a Palestinian friend, and she said it's different from Gaza. In Gaza, they said the Muslim people, the Palestinian, is really blocked. They couldn't go outside, and the outside people couldn't go inside the Gaza. So how can they survive in Gaza? How's the food come, the accommodation, and all of it?
Good question. Yeah. So people can't easily go in and out, although there are routes in and out, and I won't bore you with the detail of them. But you asked more about food and agriculture and import and export. So there are some imports and exports. They include the Egyptian crossings. So there's the pedestrian crossings. There's also the economic crossings for goods vehicles to go in and out. So they're separate. It's a separate thing. So there are some with Egypt. There are some with Israel. So yes, indeed, some goods go in from Israel into Gaza. Yeah, even though the whole situation is under siege. So there are some goods that go in, but broadly speaking, we say that these are limited by the authorities, by the Egyptian and Israeli authorities. So there's certain things that are allowed in, and that's a limited list. There is also, secondly, domestic agriculture in Gaza. So there's also some food production within Gaza. Yeah, but there's also a lot of processed food that comes in via Egypt. So there is a supply of food that comes externally from Gaza, and there's a supply of food that comes internally from Gaza.
Thank you. Apa masih dikasih waktu? Boleh satu pertanyaan lagi nggak, Kak?
Boleh, terakhir ya untuk pertanyaannya.
Okay. So the last question I want to ask is, does United Nations doesn't do anything to prevent colonization in Palestine? Because I think it's really severe. My friend said, if you want to go to pray to Al-Aqsa, you need to have like permission card. You need to make a special card, and it's really hard to get that. What does United Nations do in this conflict between Israel and Palestinian people?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's just important to say that the creation of the United Nations had a particular history. You know, it didn't exist with Adam and Eve. United Nations was created in a specific context, and the power within the United Nations has a specific story to it. And therefore, the application of the United Nations and the actual real power of the United Nations has a specific story to it based on the powers that exist in the world. So I think it's really important to say that what we call in Europe the great powers after the Second World War, they exert a lot of influence in the United Nations. So when we say, oh, you know, the United Nations, what is it doing and what can it stop and stuff, we have to remember that really the United Nations is not the end, it's the means to an end. So it's a forum in which entities apply power. Decolonization and colonization, though, it's an active issue in the West Bank, because in the West Bank, which is the other part of Palestine to Gaza, in the West Bank, Israel continues to build settlements and install its settlers from Israel proper territory into the Palestinian territory. So there's an active colonization process here, an active colonization process. However, there's also historic colonization processes, because for most Palestinians, you will hear that the creation of Israel in 1948 was a colonization process on historic Palestine. So we have to just determine what colonization are we talking about here, what periods are we referring to, and under what jurisdictions. Because what's happening now with the transfer of settlers into the West Bank by Israel is illegal under what we would call modern day international law. But what occurred in 1948 with the creation of Israel in what some will call a colonization process in that instance isn't necessarily subject to the same rules as the colonization today in the West Bank. And that's partly because the great powers basically allowed and enabled or permitted or acquiesced Israel to go about creating itself in that way. So if we're talking about the historic colonization, it's a very separate thing, subject to very different pressures and concerns than the modern day colonization that's continuing now, which exists you could argue, against a legal framework which explicitly prohibits it today. So they're very different. So the United Nations power in reality is highly limited in the Israel-Palestine conflict, to the extent that in some cases it's as if the United Nations doesn't exist. It's basically more like a charity service for Palestinians. It sounds very vulgar, but it's basically the brutal truth. That is to say that often the United Nations is there really just to provide food for the Palestinians. The United Nations agencies are just there to provide food for the Palestinians, to report on the human rights abuses that Palestinians face, and that's all they can do. So it's basically a reporting and caretaking mechanism often. That's the brutal reality of it, because there is no more instrumentalization that the United Nations can offer in this context. And so the United Nations, in a way, is sort of like the nurse that is helping the occupation continue. I mean, that it's not to make a moral judgment about it, but it offers relief for the occupation more than trying to stop the occupation. Obviously, there's words that try to stop the occupation. Every year, the United Nations will gather and it will make a vote on the Palestinian situation. It'll say we should follow this law and this law, but these are words. This is just words, and obviously words mean nothing at all. So you're talking about everyday influence in your question on people visiting holy sites in Jerusalem. And yes, some people will need specific paperwork to visit the holy sites. The United Nations is irrelevant in this context. The United Nations is irrelevant in this context. So this is not, like, for example, Jerusalem is not some neutral zone where, the United Nations is there wearing blue hats and it's there trying to keep the peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Absolutely not. You go to the holy sites in Jerusalem and it's under Israeli military control. It's under Israeli military control. The authority is the Israeli military, basically. There is no international force there. There are sometimes international observers, but they can be beaten up, detained by the Israeli forces. So let's be realistic again about the role of the United Nations.
Okay, thank you so much. But how can the Israel, in the first place, go enter Palestine? Because in the past, Palestine is part of the Turkey Empire, right? And then the king, I forgot the name, is prevent the Israel to go and claim Gaza. But how can Israel now occupy Palestine?
Yeah, to be honest, this question isn't within the scope of what we're discussing today. So I'm not going to answer that, because there are lots of resources that answer the question or the history of the Palestine conflict. I can send you a link. There's a really good book called Competing Histories, which is, I mean, it's in English, so forgive me, but in my context, it's a useful recommendation, but called Competing Histories. And it sets out the Palestinian version of the history of the conflict and the Israeli version of the history of the conflict. It's a really good book, looks at some of the history, and helps you understand the mentality, the majority mentality on both sides of the conflict. But regard to history and colonization history, it's not really within scope for today.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, maybe that is last question from Kurote. We could move to another question from another audience. Thank you, Kurote, also for your question. Okay, for the next question, there is from Arif. I'm going to read it for you. Oh, wait a second. Okay, why did you choose to cover Gaza? Even though in England, you can be a journalist, especially a football journalist, but instead, you went and get news from outside England.
Yeah, for me, I didn't choose journalism because I'm interested in journalism. I chose journalism because I'm interested in the world. So this is the key point. So I'm not interested in football. I'm not interested in celebrity gossip. I'm not interested in these sorts of things. I was interested in the British support for Israel, the human rights injustices in Palestine and the besiegement of the people of Gaza, and acting in the face of that besiegement to make contact, to act in solidarity, and to try and support and amplify the voices and messages from Gaza. This was the idea. And journalism is a tool in doing that. Journalism is a vocation, as a professional option for doing that. So for me, it's a question of what's worthwhile doing, what's worthwhile pursuing, and those were my motivations for pursuing it. Yeah.
Oke, thank you for answer. Arif, udah cukup Pak, atau misalnya masih ada yang mau ditanyakan lebih lanjut? Boleh lewat kolom chat. Oke, cukup. Oke, Arif said it's enough. Thank you for answer. Okay, for the next question, there is Claudio. Ya, Claudio udah raise hand dari tadi. Boleh Claudio? Boleh disampaikan.
Last question ya, karena waktunya last.
Oh, oke Teh. Oke, siap Teh. Okay, maybe this is for the last question in our talk show today, and it will be said by Claudio. Okay, Claudio boleh menyampaikan.
Right. So, Harry, I wanted to ask about maybe, especially in making the documentary, it might be long, it might be tiring, and it could be, there's some instances where you might felt burnt out. And my question is, what did you do so that you could get out of that phase, and so that you could always be constantly motivated? I mean, because there's maybe pressure from you yourself, because like you really wanted to help those people that are affected, but yeah, you could be tired, right? So what did you do? Especially this documentary is talking about the mental health, and especially your mental health could be affected too, right? So yeah, that's my question. How do you get out of that phase? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Assalamu'alaikum, and thank you for the question. Really great to hear you, and thank you for such an interesting question. The honest answer is I drank a lot of sugary drinks and a lot of caffeine. That is the honest answer. And I'm honestly not saying that to be funny, but at that point in my life, my coping mechanism was to focus on the work, to sacrifice a lot of my private personal life, and to focus on completing the project and consuming a lot of sugar and alcohol, and going into a kind of well, not insular, but more insulated, focused phase of life on the project. That was the honest answer. Doing so itself is probably not objectively a very healthy, balanced approach to life. So I suppose you could say that that isn't a very healthy thing to have done, but it did mean the project was finished. Yeah, maintaining the motivation, I think, which is the essence of what you're doing, of what you asked about, sorry. For me, this was something which, I mean, Gaza is something I first visited when I was a very young person. And I've seen it over several years. I have friends who are still there. I have friends who are deeply connected with the place. For me, it's something which you say Gaza, and it's, you know, it has a very deep resonance for me. I've seen 2 wars there. I've seen, you know, friends, or I have seen friends have been killed there, you know. So for me, it has a very big resonance. It's almost like a family member in a way. So for me, being able to go to Gaza because of being a journalist is an honor and a privilege. And to go to Gaza and then make a documentary about something I chose to make a documentary about because of my own personal curiosity, artistic, you know, intention, journalistic intention. This is an enormous privilege and honor. I mean, let's be clear, this is an enormous privilege and honor. And so finding the motivation, you know, it's kind of follows naturally from the process. It's something that you want to do. It's something that has to be done. Yes, okay, it's sort of a depressing topic. And as I said, it's actually a really depressing topic. It's a really hopeless topic. But that doesn't matter, because basically the truth is what's important, and the communication of that, the honoring of the people's story is what's important. So I just give you an anecdote. But in the material that we recorded in Gaza over several days, we had tens of hours of raw materials of interviews that needed to be translated. And my attitude to this is that you do not make mistakes with translation. You do not make mistakes with translation. If you're going to ask people to speak about their mental health, their intimate psychological ecosystem, how they have survived psychologically after wars, after they've seen family members killed and etc., you don't then put a 50% effort into the translation. You want to ensure that what they have said is understood fully in context, fully in the local dialect of exactly the community within Gaza in which they've spoken. And so our process for translation of the raw material before editorial judgments were made was exhaustive. It was a multi-person translation unit. We had some in-person translation in the documentary unit. We had some translators working remotely, and we had a 3-phase translation. So we had an initial translation, a second level verification of the translation, and then a tertiary level final approval of the translation. That's the approach we took to it. And so we didn't skimp on this sort of detail, because you have to honor the people who have opened up to you. You have to honor the truth of the message. You don't sort of get artistic and, sort of miss things out. So that's the philosophy I took towards it. And for me, that didn't come with a difficulty. That came naturally, because as I said, I care about it. It was a great honor to investigate this issue, to go there, to package the content and share it with the world.
Okay, thank you Harry for your answer. Dari Claudio, apakah sudah jelas atau ada pertanyaan lanjutan?
Thank you very much. And yeah, your story is very inspiring, and I hope that one day we could learn a lot more from you, and maybe one day we could meet and do a project together. So thank you, Harry.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Okay, and maybe
Harry, that means one day you have to come to Indonesia.
I'm waiting for the invitation.
Inshallah, let's speak in detail about this later, inshallah. Thank you.
Okay, mashallah. Okay, alhamdulillah. And maybe that was the last question for today's talk show. Thank you for all the audience. Terima kasih buat seluruh peserta ya yang telah antusias gitu bertanya kepada Harry, dan buat teman-teman yang pertanyaannya belum dijawab, mungkin ya semoga tadi doanya bisa terjabah gitu, gimana Harry bisa datang ke Indonesia dan juga bercengkerama sama teman-teman langsung, dan kalau mau ada discuss lebih lanjut mungkin ya, atau kalau teman-teman mungkin mau keep in touch sama Harry, nanti mungkin teman-teman panitia kalau bisa mungkin kirim Instagramnya gitu ya lewat via kolom chat, barangkali teman-teman mau nanya via DM gitu ya. Okay, and Harry, as me, Aska, and on behalf of our entire team, I would like to say thank you very much for all the explanation, all of your stories, and many insights. And also, I'm really fascinated by lots of your like theoretical things, and I mean, much things that I've just heard about, the world in your perspective. I'm really interested to know a lot more about that. So I also hope that we could meet in another occasion, and maybe in the future if you come to Indonesia, or maybe from a Zoom meeting, it's okay. And maybe before we close our agenda, is there any closing statement that you would want to say to us?
Well, I would love to make a couple of comments. First of all, I would love to thank the hosts, including yourself, for doing a fantastic job and offering your hospitality, for your clarity of questions and communication, and to thank everyone that asked questions in the chat on the video. I'm grateful to you for your curiosity on this subject and for honoring me with this invitation. It's always a pleasure to join you. So thank you very much indeed. And Sam, to all of you. With regard to the topic, I'll just make a couple of closing remarks. So depending on our context, I was brought up in Oxford and studied in England. We all have our own kind of imagination or story of what Gaza or the Palestine conflict is. And I know that in Southeast Asia, there's often one sort of image, which is the conflict's very religious and this sort of thing. I'd like to just say that we must all be careful to challenge our own senses of stories, because often as journalists, we're required to be more objective than the average person with these things. And so in the UK, we kind of think, well, you know, the Palestinians are treated badly, but the Israelis are more like us than the Palestinians. And this is one of the kind of the biases that are present in our culture. And we don't think of it as a religious conflict in the UK, whereas in Southeast Asia, we more see it as a religious conflict, or people are discussing it in a religious context. Well, you know, I'm here to tell you that there's a high level of resolution to reality that isn't captured by these simple images. That is to say that the Palestinians who are Christian are treated just as the same as the Palestinians who are Muslim. And the Israeli treatment of Palestinians isn't anything to do with Judaism. So this is irrelevant from religion in many ways. I'm sorry to tell you that. So I'm asking us all, including myself, to strive to have a better, deeper, higher resolution, higher fidelity, attention to detail and objectivity and discerningness when it comes to looking at these difficult stories. Because with this, we will find the really breakthrough and socially beneficial narratives and analyses that make our work worthwhile, and that will make audiences engaged, because we will cut through the truth. So that's my message. Thank you again to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, mashallah. Thank you, Harry, for your closing statement. Maybe I would like to say it in Indonesian way about your closing statement. Ya, mashallah teman-teman. Bener gitu ya. Tadi closing statementnya juga membangkitkan jiwa kita gitu untuk sadari gitu ya, bahwasanya kondisi di Palestina ini tuh udah bukan terkait agama gitu ya, karena sejatinya di Palestina pun baik warga Palestina yang Muslim ataupun Kristen itu diperlakukan sama gitu ya, dan ini juga tidak berkaitan dengan Israel yang mereka Yahudi gitu ya. Jadi memang kita perlu membuka mata gitu ya akan kondisi ini gitu. Thank you, Harry, for your closing statement. And for the really last agenda for our today's talk show, we would like to have a documentation with all of the audience here. So I would ask to all the audience to turn on their camera. Wait a second. Oke, teman-teman, sekarang kita mau masuk sesi dokumentasi ya. Jadi boleh yang masih belum on cam atau yang mau berbenah dulu supaya bisa terlihat proper gitu ya di kamera, silakan untuk dirapi-rapihkan dan boleh dinyalakan kameranya ya. Aku kasih waktu sampai 3:57 mungkin ya. Sambil teman-teman panitia juga siap-siap bagian dokumentasi sama Teh Fania ya?
Yes, Teh Fania.
Oke, siap. Oke.
Masih ditunggu ya untuk teman-teman yang mau on cam lagi.
Oke.
Oke, masih ada yang mau on cam lagi? Sampai slide kedua, ini udah slide ketiga.
Oke.
Oke, masih ada ya.
Oke. Menit lagi kali ya.
Oke, cuma sampai slide 3. Nggak ada yang mau on cam lagi?
Masih nambah, Teh?
Masih nambah ya.
Nambah. Oke, sampai 3:57 lagi.
Oke, yang lain juga ya on cam. Masih ditunggu 1 menit lagi. Oke, masih ada lagi.
aja Teh Fani.
Okay, I will start to document, to take the picture. Okay, I'll start. 1, 2, 3, take the pose. Okay, to slide 2. 1, 2, 3, smile. And the last slide in 3, please smile. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tefania. Okay, maybe that was the end of our talk here today. And once again, I would really express my gratitude to you, Harry, for your attendance today. And maybe all of the audience feels the same too as me. And me as today's moderator, would give all this authority of today's agenda back to the Master of Ceremony, to Teh Ariana. Oke, aku sebagai moderator mungkin pamit undur diri. Mohon maaf teman-teman kalau masih banyak kekurangannya. Dan aku kembalikan agenda acara ke MC, yaitu Teh Ariana atau Teh Dia.
Oke, terima kasih luar biasa. Gimana pejuang Baik Berisik? Mantap banget kan ya? Luar biasa, dapat berbagai informasi yang insightful dan juga deep information dari Hari dan juga Teh Askan nih, pejuang Baik Berisik. Oke, dan karena tadi sudah sudah lengkap dari awal sampai dengan akhir, sudah juga foto dan lain sebagainya, maka ada tambahan mungkin dari Panitia informasi, beberapa informasi. Silahkan mungkin kalau ada informasi boleh untuk berkabar di chat box yang, tapi ketika memang sudah dirasa cukup, boleh juga berkabar nanti biar disudahi dengan pihak rekaman. Gimana Teh Panitia di sana, Teh Fania, Teh Zahra, Teh Fai, Teh Fai, dan selamat. Oke, ada lagi mungkin dari Panitia atau sudah dicukupkan? Sepertinya ini. Oh ya, sebelumnya selain soal pejuang Baik Berisik juga welcome ya teman-teman dari Jurnalistik kelas A dan juga kelas B di sini. Pantesan tadi tuh banyak banget partisipannya, jadi ternyata ada teman-teman dari masa jurnalistik ya. Ini juga alumni jurnalistik teman-teman, tapi dari 2018. Saya juga ya. Oh iya, jangan lupa teman-teman buat pejuang Baik Berisik, pohon presensi dulu. Boleh untuk di copy dan juga di paste untuk presensinya di http://bit.ly/presensi.bb ya. Berarti ini udah ya untuk benar untuk konfirmasi dulu kepada ini pejuang Baik Berisik ya, kepada panitia tentang acaranya disudahnya penting ada informasi selanjutnya. Oke, baik para pejuang Baik Berisik dan juga teman-teman, bahwasanya acara kita pada hari ini sudah selesai. Terima kasih buat kontribusinya di kelas seperti di talk show pada hari ini. Semoga apa yang tadi didengarkan dan didapatkan serta ditanyakan bisa untuk jadi ilmu yang nanti bisa direferensi untuk di future-nya teman-teman untuk bisa jadi orang-orang yang terus bergerak dalam gitu aja. Nah, saya sebagai MC mengucapkan terima kasih dan juga minta maaf atas segala kesalahan baik itu teknis, perkataan dan pembahasan yang mungkin kurang berkenan di hati teman-teman dan juga pejuang Baik Berisik sekalian. Mari kita tutup acara pada siang hari ini, sore hari ini dengan mengucap hamdalah bersama. Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim, alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim, istighfar dengan sebagai istighfar, astagfirullahaladzim, dan dipamungkasi dengan doa-doa diri. Silakan Allah kenal, dan juga masyaallah sampai di sini saya mengucapkan selamat berjuang untuk para pejuang Baik Berisik dan juga pejuang kebaikan. Maka Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Teman-teman,